This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam. And I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
People that have so much to gain and have such material motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader?
Don't remember his name.
You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
now these people are in very high positions,
Yes. Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 232. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we are going to dive into part 15 of The Land Belongs to Whom It Belongs. Our long survey of Palestine from the Ottoman era up through the mid-20th century and the creation of Israel.
Yeah.
Right? So...
Yeah, we've been recording this on the 17th of December, 2024.
A lot has happened.
Yeah, a lot
since
has
the
been going
last
on
chapter we
in that
recorded.
region. Yeah, lately. We were talking about how it's a bit, I don't want to say serendipitous, but maybe synchronistic. Your way of phrasing it was that, like, this is kind of like Sykes-Picot reloaded. I mean, certainly you can see like the consequences of Sykes-Picot in the present day in terms of the like Syrian context, like all these, Palestine, Syria, like those are all part of Sham, the Levant, these, and there was even, as we talked about in a previous episode, like there was even some discussion about Palestine maybe being part of like a Syrian state, right? And that was something that was kind of factored into the revolt of 1936, which we might not get to this episode, but we'll get to soon. Maybe this episode.
Definitely get into the precipitating tensions.
Yeah. So, of course, Israel invading Syria now. So
I think when this history, it can move fast sometimes. And I think it was in mid-September when we recorded the episode about Dub Mufti, the last chapter of this series. And I think we opened that by talking about what was at the time all over the news and seemed like a big new deal, a big new escalation, which was the Mossad beeper attacks in Lebanon.
Yeah.
Right. And then,
exactly. Yeah. Which led directly to what's happened since, I think, in a big way, not the only factor, but certainly like a decisive one.
Right. So in those 3 short months, Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated. The most of the leadership of Hezbollah was actually assassinated. A war was kind of declared on Lebanon, and then a kind of strange ceasefire was promulgated, and then just a week later, Syria, seemingly out of nowhere, the sort of civil war conflict roars back to life, and Assad finally goes. And so now we're talking, that's a lot of things to happen in a short amount of time of, no Assad, no Nasrallah in just the span of the end of 2024. And now, in terms of like what will happen next, very hard to say, but we can see the kind of primary actors. We can even see now, some people, I don't know if I'd like, necessarily how much I agree with this, but there's even talk now of kind of, Erdogan's Ottoman revanchism and, his great dream for the revival of...
This like just today, the day that we're recording this, I saw like an article. I think it was a Middle East forum written by a guy saying like the U.S. needs to prepare to kill Turks in Syria. Like the U.S. should be ready to kill Turks in Syria.
Okay.
Which is like, they're technically a NATO ally.
Who was saying this?
It was some journalist, but it was like, for a Middle East forum. But it was like still like an insane statement, or like certainly a radical tonal shift, noticeable, definitely noticeable, like and I mean I think
Hmm.
that's something if you like track like the Israeli media, the discourse around Turkey, like since October 7th, that's kind of been brewing.
Hmm.
And certainly like there's a lot of, yeah. So I think, I mean, in terms of going forward, like again, like this is not to say that like Erdogan is not disappointing or that like he's someone to be like admired or that he's what people would like. And I don't think that necessarily like Iran won't be able to like serve as a check on Israel, or that like Hezbollah is like destroyed or anything like that, like
Yeah,
that
I
it
wouldn't
won't
go that
Hezbollah won't
far.
be able to rebuild, or that Iran won't be
Hmm.
able to act as check it on Israel and so. But obviously, like I think with this, I don't want to get too much into the geopolitics of modern Syria, but like certainly we've seen Iran be like dealt a heavy blow, so it does kind of
Certainly.
seem like Turkey might be the best option to step up in terms of being a check towards the Israel's ambitions, which seem to be just escalating out of all reason. Not that they weren't before, but even more
Well,
so.
I think now
Uh,
with the most recent events in Lebanon and Syria now and the Israeli, incursions into the Golan, in the Golan Heights, right? Like kind
yeah,
of
and even
temporarily
beyond,
taking over Syrian territory,
yeah,
inching closer to Damascus. I
yeah,
think that
violating the 1974 agreement. Yeah.
right,
Anyway,
right. Everything that we've read thus far about the wild dreams of like these kind of early Zionists and their, throughout kind of Israeli history, this talk of a greater Israel,
yeah.
that shit just got a lot more real in the last
No, yeah,
even
that's
just
like, I mean,
1 month.
if you
Like,
listen back to some episodes in the series, I remember like very clearly saying like, are they gonna stop? And it seems like they're not gonna stop. Seems like we've basically been vindicated in, the idea that like they will not stop at the West Bank and Gaza. Like they
no,
will
they're going to take as
continue,
much
yeah,
as they can
as
take.
much as they can, yeah.
This is, what I think as we move closer in the period of like the mid to late British Mandate, a lot of the currents in the Zionist movement, were very upfront about, at least amongst themselves, about, what needed to be done in terms of, the colonial project they were engaged
Yeah,
in, and how, some of them were very blunt about, like we are going to have to conquer the people that are on this land
yeah,
and
and
like
we're gonna have
drive them
to,
out.
yeah, exactly.
And or somebody who we might get to a little bit today, a big rabble rousing figure, Zeev Jabotinsky, who
Hmm.
was kind of the more extreme faction that broke away from the already somewhat extreme, mainstream Zionists into revisionist Zionism. But he had that song that became a famous song of like the youth brigades, right? That referenced both sides of the Jordan River as belonging to us, right? Like
Hmm.
that's ours too. It had some refrain of like the east side of the Jordan, that's ours too. Or something like that. He had a very maximalist vision of like the entire territory had to become, greater Israel, and you couldn't there was not going to be any sharing of power with like the Arab population there and stuff. But now I think you're seeing like that long time dream. People are actually trying to put it into effect, and I think at this point also it's kind of bringing in once the Syria thing happened, I think maybe it became a little clearer why the Democrats were behaving the way they were in terms of like supporting Israel and like low key, not that low key, but kind of letting them looking the other way and giving them weapons and letting them get away with it. It was because they've dealt all these body blows to the geostrategic enemies in the region of the United States. And now whatever plans they have for post-Assad Syria or Lebanon, if they can kind of try to uproot Hezbollah there or crush them even further, it's like they let their mad dog off the leash, and that's why they had to just be awkward about it and not actually do anything to rein in the Israelis because they wanted them to do what they were doing. It's still kind of a jump ball to see what where it goes from there. I think that journalist you cited, they might be on Team Kurd. I would probably imagine.
Michael Rubin is the guy who is
Hmm.
director of policy analysis, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Middle Eastern countries.
Okay.
His career includes time as a Pentagon official with field experiences in Iran, Yemen, and Iraq, as well as engagements with the Taliban prior to 9/11. Blah
Oh,
blah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it
So
sounds
yeah,
like
his most
a
recent article
classic
on December
neocon.
17th, that's today. United States needs to prepare to kill Turks in Syria. Will Trump fund Islamist extremists in Syria? Could Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev collapse like Assad? Is Jordan's King Abdullah II a dead man walking? This
Oh
guy is
no.
like really
Wow.
got his knives
Okay.
out for
No, I
everybody.
mean that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
actually, I mean, I think
Syrian
that
rebel leader borrows a page from Khomeini and Erdogan's playbook. Few will mourn Assad regime's demise, but an enemy of an enemy is not necessarily a friend. Yeah, this is one of my things is like, you know, and I feel like in kind of like leftist like spheres where people like kind of are sympathetic to like this whole like resistance axis, like I've said many times, like
mhm,
that like Hezbollah, Iran, Yemen, like those are the groups that have like done something, they've been like
correct. Yeah.
yeah, defeated significantly. However, like they tried more than like the Sunni countries thus far have.
Hmm.
But like I think some people who were partial to that axis, like because of that, like now sort of have this sense that like, and I get it, like it's reasonable. I wouldn't expect like this new government to be better than Assad, but I also think that like one shouldn't be giving up like Syria for lost and like just thinking like, oh, Israel runs it now. They're all like just like they're like Israel's puppets or whatever. Like no, like this like needs to be held and like defended. And like there needs to be like pressure on them like actually to stop that, like, insofar as like one can. Obviously there's only so much one can do, but like we need to not like assume that like Syria's sovereignty has completely been eclipsed. Like it needs to actually be asserted, and because it
Well,
still does exist. Uh,
yeah, yeah, and it ought to exist, I think. I guess I think there's probably a lot of like pessimism influencing maybe that kind of line that like it's
yeah,
lost because you can see where the trends are kind of going with it, where this kind of this guy with an Al Qaeda background, this kind of Abu Zelensky looking figure, ready for the media, kind of comes out and is like nominally in control. But then you have the SNA, the Turkish backed
yeah,
forces, kind of
hmm
coming in, the heavily backed by Erdogan, and like he's obviously he's caught in a very delicate situation where he's kind of been saying things like we don't want any smoke with Israel, like we're not
yeah,
trying to
exactly, yeah.
like do anything. I mean, I think that like it's very hard for me. I would agree with you in the sense of like just wait and this has all happened very fast. Let's wait and see kind of what they do, or what they're
Yeah.
able to do. However, I'm definitely very worried that like an Iraq/Libya kind of dynamic, an anarcho-colonialist dynamic is about to like descend
Well,
upon.
that's likely to be the case. Like, and I'm certainly not expecting fireworks from Ashara or Jelani, nay Jelani. But I think like it's true. Like, for instance, like sanctions, like, yeah, those need to be lifted in order, like, they can't like do anything, like they would just get like absolutely annihilated. And I think that seems to be the way to me the winds are going to start blowing. I think like maybe we agree about this is that like there's this notion that like, oh, this is like the outcome that is like, wanted. Like they did want Assad to be gone, but
Yeah.
this is not who they want to be in charge of Syria. They want like to completely, yeah,
I
they
wouldn't
like,
say this is like their end, yeah, like their end game
no,
and they're satisfied. It's not the perfect fix, basically. It's like,
yeah,
okay, well, that's who you needed to use to get you needed basically
exactly. And
to
now
get
like
Assad out,
I
but
think
now
yeah, and
it's
now
part
I
two
think
of the
yes,
game.
exactly. It was useful, like, and they're aligned in that way. However, now I think yeah, like it's kind of like I think disorienting for people because now all the rhetoric that I think was adopted by a lot of people because and like again, like like these groups like that like now have become HTS. One shouldn't like minimize the like all that happened in terms of like trying to purge people with ISIS and Al Qaeda sympathies like through like violence and things like that. However, like at the same time, a lot of these people like are culpable for war crimes and like committed atrocities while they were in like, in the Syrian civil war, like from like,
Right.
2013 to like 2017, like,
Totally.
all these different atrocities, like which in an ideal world, like they would be held to account for, as would, and I mean, in an ideal world, like you wouldn't be like, well, about someone like Assad like being deposed either. Unfortunately, we don't live in an ideal world, so we do have to be like, well, about him. But like,
Yeah.
it's a similar situation. But so I think that it's disorienting for people because like they're like, oh, kind of adopting the rhetoric, which it makes sense that like Iran and that al-Assad, like, his government used, about like all these people being kind of like filthy, disgusting, like terrorists, like Islamists, of like no redeeming features. Like they're just like, Haji, like orcs. But now that is what I think Israel is going to say. That's like going to, be their line. And
well, it was always
that,
it was always convenient for them to have some of these groups running around painting, giving Islam a bad name, basically, through these, groups like ISIS, which, I think there's evidence of quiet kind of assistance and things like that. And it makes you wonder when like the ISIS affiliate just blew up a mosque in Iran. It's like, okay, that's a weird vibe. Like, why? Like,
well,
you know what I
mean?
mean?
ISIS-K is like incredibly sus. Like that is like beyond like even normal ISIS. Like definitely you're also right in the context of Syria too.
But
like
normal
there
ISIS
was kind
went
of like
pretty
turning
hard,
a
like-
blind eye to
Yeah.
I mean also like the US did like go pretty hard in like fighting ISIS as well. But it was like kind of partially a pretext to get a foothold in Syria.
ISIS
so
was
it's
their
convenient
ticket.
in that way.
ISIS was literally their ticket. If ISIS hadn't gone after like the Yazidi minorities and other people and started going on kind of like
Exactly, yeah.
pogroms, basically, then and also like fought against the Kurds and everything, then we wouldn't have had the entire like excuse to roll out this narrative. And also
Exactly, yeah.
the conspicuous like beheading of these American hostages, like James Foley. We forget that it was like actually that was the most. It was the combination of like they're genociding Yazidis, and then they kidnapped this sus journalist who was full like most of these like CIA looking dudes that were roaming around Syria in the early part of the war and got kidnapped by some faction or another. And then that bizarre beheading the jihadi John beheading video, the whole spectacle of it was like it felt so tailor made for basically giving the US like uh a casus belli to like actually go in and with their air power and their drones and their special forces and their iPads, etc. And like basically what we saw happen strategically was they were able to militarily intervene in northeastern Syria and in like Deir ez-Zor and by the border in that whole region that produces most of the wheat and the oil for Syria, right?
Yeah.
And then even
Exactly.
when Trump
Which
quote
now
unquote
like they're
pulled
gonna
out,
try to not leave based on the same thing of like their ISIS fighting mission. Anyway, sorry, continue.
right? As long as ISIS like kind of exists and it kind of like
Yeah.
it was beaten down pretty aggressively by and not just the U.S. but Russia and Iran and Hezbollah as well.
Yeah.
Like really probably went the hardest on them, and because I think they could peep the kind of geopolitical chess game that was kind of happening there where ISIS, and it's still kind of it's a mysterious open question to like, was everything ISIS did something that deep in the halls of like the deep state,
Right.
that they were
No,
like,
I would say no, but like
it's
not
hard
everything.
to tell. Like the invisible, boomerang back and almost overrunning all of Iraq. Like, I'm not sure that like that part was like signed off by some the Langley or whatever the fuck or like the
No,
Atlantic
I think
Council
it's-
wanted that to
yeah.
happen. But though maybe if a generalized strategy towards keeping this region just like ripped apart and as
Yes,
destabilized
I
and
think
weak
like
as possible.
destabilization is like the goal. Yeah, and exactly. And they don't necessarily want to do anything that's going to like add stability and it's going to allow like Syria to establish like a state, like a functioning, stable state. Like now, or they wanted to undermine it in the past, and they definitely want to prevent it. I think now,
And it gave us a ticket to go back to Iraq, right?
Yeah.
Under Obama, after we made a big thing about leaving, and then a few years later, it's like, well, Iraq is going to get overrun by people that say they want to like kill every Shia, so All right, I
Yeah.
guess like they have no choice but to accept us back once again and be up there in the north in Erbil doing our little games. And if you look at it as like viewing Iraq as kind of like at least partially part of the axis of resistance in a practical sense, because you have these like military, these sort of like Shia militia groups and stuff that are kind of have free, it seems like relatively free reign around the country, right?
Yeah,
And then
yeah.
you also have
Iran
the
definitely has like
Kurds
a
in the
lot
north.
of like power projection into Syria. I mean, sorry, into Iraq for sure.
Right, right.
Um,
So like disrupting, making sure their country is just like, weak and kind of caught up in its own shit and like disrupted, could have sort of like side benefits. And, you don't want it to get like built up into like a more powerful Shia ally for Iran that can extend into the Arab world. Those calculations absolutely had to be being made by all the whiz kids and NatSec
yeah.
planners like in the
Yeah,
Obama years. And
absolutely. Like they
that plan
could
I
have
think has
like
been
just like
continued
gotten
mostly.
rid of Idlib, at some point, like if they wanted to, but they definitely wanted even before like HTS made like overtures and changes to try to like be a more palatable alternative to Assad, like they could have just been like, we're gonna glass this place, if they truly wanted to, but they chose not to.
You mean
So
the U.S. or
the US
Assad?
could
Oh yeah,
have, yeah.
yeah. No, I mean they
Um,
could have. Like there are constant stories and stuff about like like I don't know, weird special ops units like evacuating ISIS guys out of like Raqqa before it got like overrun, by you know
yeah.
either the Kurds or like the SAA and stuff, and kind of like not wanting them to be completely annihilated. So because that's like the whole excuse of why we have to be over there. And I guess like the sucker punch that in this whole big game of the Syria thing that I have to confess I didn't necessarily like see coming is how the events springing off of October 7th and in Gaza and Israel's kind of reaction to that and the Western support for it would eventually kind of boomerang back around and spread to Lebanon and then potentially kind of link up to this larger project in Syria. And it's still unclear. Like, I don't know. I feel like both Turkey and Israel are kind of like they're going to try to take as much as they can get out of this chaotic situation, especially before Trump comes in. And maybe they both see themselves as, well, we're going to be the new big dogs in this region.
Yeah.
The Ottomans are they're going to be somewhat back a little bit. Like, they're going to start kind of intervening.
Ideally,
Well,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's like I'm not sure how. I think there's, it's hard to gauge how much like Erdogan. I mean, I think also there was, I think as much as Erdogan will talk shit about Israel, but like in terms of like, really going hard against them, he seems to also have like a pragmatic side of dealing with Bibi. But I wouldn't say
Yeah, in the
they're
past, definitely.
actually
It's
true
like
allies or anything like that.
there's been
But
like
also the NATO
rapprochement
thing.
recently, and then a little bit more recently, there's been like a little bit of a push. I think it's like a political issue for Erdogan within Turkey. Like I think his
Yeah.
opposition like hammers him on that.
Right.
So
Right.
like on his past like sort of rapprochement with Israel. So now he's kind of like moving it. I mean, he did have that thing where like he screamed at like Shimon Peres like about like how much he knows about killing or whatever. I forget exactly where they were, but yeah, like Erdogan like screamed at him like that he was like a murderer. Yeah, so I feel like they don't necessarily like each other. And certainly like if you've been following, that's the thing, like if you've been following like the Israeli media and like the sort of consensus that's being manufactured right now, it's not like, oh, like we got everything that we wanted and like now it's over. Like it's like no, we need to like crush, like we need to be worried about Turkey and we need to go in and crush them. Basically like they're creating a pretext like for them to further go into Syria for their quote unquote self-defense and quote unquote safety. And I think like kind
Right.
of feeding into that by like I don't know, I just don't like it.
It,
And
it
yeah.
it'll be interesting
Um
because now we're talking about these two actors who could potentially at least come to like proxy blows with each other, and definitely like in terms of their founding kind of ideologies, they are antagonistic, I would say. Like, in turn,
yeah.
if both of them have maximalist goals for either Greater Turkey or, Neo-Ottoman, whatever, or, Greater Israel, those two things are going to bump up against each other, right?
Yeah.
But then you have Turkey, a NATO ally, and then Israel, they're not in NATO, but like by all metrics they may
Yeah.
as well be in NATO. Like there's basically Article 5 for them. Like
Yeah.
they're almost practically part of that club and in terms of being staunch US allies. So I wonder, is there going to be a proxy battle maybe? Because I've already been seeing among those like neocons, like that journalist you quoted, and people like the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, and these kind of like Israeli connected neocon think tanks in Washington, that a lot of them are really hyping up like we can't abandon the Kurds, like we have to support the
Oh yeah,
Kurds
they've been like that. I mean, I remember even like when Trump
because the
like
Turks.
famously abandoned the Kurds, Netanyahu came out and he was like, "The gallant Kurdish people need our support and we must help them," kind of as
Hmm.
like an FU to Erdogan, like almost directly, like
Right,
saying like even though Trump is leaving, like don't worry, like you can always count on Israel, oh gallant Kurds or whatever.
right,
And
right.
yeah, it's kind of
And I feel like
yeah,
the KRG, like the Peshmerga, like Iraqi Kurds, I feel like
yeah.
they're pretty tight with Israel. Like they
Definitely,
are
yeah. The
almost,
Syrian Kurds like don't
well,
like they might have gotten help, but they don't like necessarily like acknowledge, they're a little bit like cagey about it.
well, of course,
They don't
because they
like
have
because
a
it's it
image
would
to
be
uphold, right?
yeah,
They have
exactly.
a
Yeah. Oh, yeah,
heckin'
true. Yeah, they
democratic
do
and
have a heckin'
federalist image
image.
to uphold, and
Yeah.
maybe a lot of leftists in the West don't like to hear it because they thought there was at least one faction in Syria that were like pretty good guys, that
Yeah.
that you
The
could
actual
support.
US proxy that like somehow everyone forgets that like they're the ones that are
Yeah,
directly a US proxy, but
which I
whatever.
feel like now is
Um
confronted with like two options of like they can either double down on being a US proxy and try to defend their territory against Turkey, who's a NATO member. So I'm not sure like how that's gonna work, but like who knows what Trump will do?
the
Maybe,
sad thing, yeah, yeah, sorry,
or
keep going.
they can valiantly refute, or they I guess option two, they can get more Israeli support, which might like protect them, who knows, against, or support them in a proxy battle against Turkey, or they could like not have that and they'll get annihilated. Like so I
Well,
you know
what
what I
they
mean? Like
should do is like fold themselves into like the Syrian state. Like, and they should like become part of like the Syrian military. Like, that's what they should do, I think. Like, and so like not like that would be the thing that they should do and not like hold out like a rump state or like some kind of like Kurdish canton in
mhm.
northeast Syria. Like they should just like stop doing that. And yeah, that's
Well,
like I think what like
so
because otherwise, like I don't know, it's just yeah.
they
Um,
might try to get something out of it in a kind of like Bosnian
exactly. Yeah.
solution where they get a kind of Republika Srpska kind of thing,
Hmm.
that has like some autonomy, but they still have like fealty to the government. But I feel like their choices are going to be heavily constrained by whatever the U.S. wants them to do
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was
because they
gonna
wouldn't
say. The
exist
sad
without
thing
the
is
U.S.
that yeah, like it's really like the like ability that like Syrians have to determine what will happen, or even the Kurds themselves or anything, any group in Syria has to determine what will happen, is like heavily constrained by like the power that the US has. Yeah, like we are just saying, like they can't really do anything like about like right now because like they're just like they've been at war for what like 14 years. They like just can't really like, you know,
Well,
do anything right now. Otherwise, then
yeah.
just like fight a pointless battle against Israel and get annihilated and give them the reason to just continue invading.
Which is
So,
probably what would happen if they were to try such a thing. I mean, now they have
yeah,
no ammunition
they can
stores, they
basically
have
just
no
like
missile
beg.
defense
Yeah.
systems, they have no navy. Israel has
They can just like
been
appeal to
destroying
international
all of it.
law, which exactly they can just like appeal to international law, which like, constantly favors Israel and is like kind of a farce that doesn't
Yeah,
ever like come to the
yeah.
defense of
Been working so
the
great the last year and a
yeah,
half.
exactly. That's all they can do basically, and just say like, hey, like back off. Like so basically they need a strong partner like Turkey, or they need Hezbollah. That's the thing. Like I was saying before we started, like recording, like sectarianism is, and we'll see this a little bit in the history that we get into, like and all sorts of other ways to divide people. Like
Hmm.
these are like the ultimate like psyops. Like if it weren't for like Sunni
Hmm.
Shia sectarianism, like
Yeah.
not if it weren't, I don't want to like overemphasize like the importance of this phenomenon because I think that's like one of the biggest errors that people make, but you definitely can see how it's a huge problem, and it has really irritated me like these last couple of weeks, like seeing like
You
the
hate to see it.
sectarianism.
I
Yeah,
was
because
yeah, I
like if
was
it weren't like if
watching.
Muslims could just unite,
Mhm.
like then like if Hezbollah didn't feel that they had to like defend Assad to begin with, and like that they could trust that like what would be like that there could be a partnership with whatever replaced him, like I don't know, like, and they like undermine their credibility so much, like in the Arab world in general and what they did, and like now, like they're like not as well liked anymore. Like it's harder for them to move around and to operate.
Yeah.
Like they diminished themselves and made themselves like weaker as a result, and then more
And at the
vulnerable to Israel.
and at the
It's just
same
like I
time,
don't,
like you said,
yeah,
at the same time, like you said, I think their tactical decision to like defend the Assad regime was like very rational and like understandable from like a geostrategic perspective, that like because they couldn't trust what was going to replace Assad, because all these foreign powers and these Gulf kingdoms and the
right,
US
yeah.
and Europe were doing this kind of
Especially early on. Like honestly, like I feel like I'm more optimistic that like the like HTS regime won't be like, again, this still could easily be the outcome, especially given like all the overwhelming pressures that are on them. Like, and it could, I think still the most likely outcomes are either like a Jordan/Egypt situation where
yeah,
like they're totally like compatible and
right.
just like basically like go along with the Zionist project, or like we were talking about like just like complete like chaos, and like no like stability is even allowed to form whatsoever. But I'm
Mhm.
more optimistic like a better outcome than I would have been like at the very beginning of the Syrian civil war or like the Arab Spring, because like then a lot of these sort of like empty suits that you had like floating around, these like complete frauds, like people who you still see like come out being like he's a leader in the non-existent like made up thing of the FSA or
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah,
like
yeah. These like
then yeah,
expat
like
agitators.
no, like yeah, exactly, like they couldn't necessarily trust that due to like these dynamics. So that's yeah, it was not like it certainly wasn't irrational.
No.
It definitely didn't
But at the
pan
same
out,
time, when
but
you're a
yeah,
distinct minority within the greater Muslim world, right? What are we talking? The Shias, like 12%, something like that,
like 10,
right?
yeah, 10,
Yeah,
12,
like
yeah.
10%, and like a minority in, with the exception, I guess Iraq is the only Arab Shia majority state, but but usually a minority in elsewhere. And like if the optics become like
I think
Hezbollah is
Bahrain is also Shia
right,
majority, but they're like, not. It's again
the
a
wealthy
minority
Gulf
rule
kingdom.
situation. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but I mean, it's an uphill battle, and I think this is like exactly what the how the imperialists like it, is that like even if you do what you think is necessary and you feel like you have a good defense for it and you're supporting the axis of resistance and blah blah blah, if you kind of if the perception among the Sunni population, or even a majority of the Sunni population, not everybody, thinks that, oh, well, you guys are sectarian, siding with the Shia dictator, and you're just oppressing Sunnis and blah blah blah. Well, then that's a huge PR blow to like Hezbollah in the Sunni
Yeah.
Arab world,
Yes.
which like I fully feel like they sort of did what they had to do in that situation. However, you can acknowledge that it probably had some bad PR kind of consequences as well. It had some a little
Yeah, it did.
blowback in terms of PR, which I
Yeah,
thought,
I mean, I
was
think the decision that
decreasing.
what they eventually came to was that, like, and again, like I said, like I understand, like in context, I think that, like in a vacuum, like I don't know, I just think like, and maybe you and I are like a little bit of a different on this, but I just don't like, I don't think that al-Assad, and again, I do see like why like a reasonable person would be like, okay, well, but this is the best option we can have, right? And like that, definitely, there's a totally reasonable argument made for that. But I don't think this guy was a good leader, and and I do also think that like eventually the decision that Iran came to, and maybe they were right at the time. I don't know. I won't say that they were wrong from their point of view to defend him. But I feel like eventually the decision that they came to was that this is a sunk cost, like, or like that we're not going to keep sinking this cost, like this is a lost cause, like, and we're gonna just
Well, yeah,
not
that's why. I mean,
they've
I'm not
and so and
gonna.
it like You
Gnash
know,
my teeth over like
yeah,
Assad.
yeah.
I mean,
I mean,
he
hindsight,
folded. Like
hindsight's 2020.
he
So
lost.
you can say, yeah, exactly. He lost, and that's the thing. Like,
But
you
I
know,
like I just it just grinds my gears that so much of this was stoked and escalated from outside with the explicit intention for like very cynical geopolitical purposes to overthrow
yeah,
this guy who was targeted as kind of like, oh, this guy's weak, like we can get rid of him. And I
yes.
think that was probably like an accurate. I mean, he wasn't supposed to be the leader of Syria. Like he's just
No, he
a mild
wasn't.
mannered ophthalmologist, and he
He was
inherited an
like, I mean,
apparatus
first
that
of all, like,
his whole family
Hafez.
ran that was like
Yeah, first of all, he shouldn't have appointed a family member to begin with. Like, if you're going by like Ba'athist ideology, but like even still, like even within that sort of flawed idea that Hafez had, like he should have, like he didn't want to pick Bashar. He wanted like
right.
several people before him. Yeah, and even that itself was like, yeah, it was, yeah.
It's like,
It's
the
wasn't
Sharif of Mecca, like not all his sons were really up to snuff, and he had a couple
Yeah,
golden boys, and
exactly. Yeah.
you
No,
know,
no, yeah. Definitely like it's certainly not like wildly out of step with like a lot of regimes in the Arab world that you could, I mean we'll sort of see as things come to light, and I definitely think like there's but at the same time, there's atrocities on both sides. But again, like I'm not like I don't know. I just roll my eyes at like kind of the heroization of this guy. And I think that started kind of to fall away. But I don't think that's the big problem. Like, I think that really the thing is like, I guess we just need to like look forward and not like be caught up in like litigating the past, or certainly not like taking the anger out at, what could be, um, like, checks to whatever extent against like more bloodshed and more instability, like and like I get it. I get how people are frustrated and they feel like people were manipulated and like if only and that is frustrating. Like I said, this part of these sort of things that, are difficult to eradicate and difficult to disentangle. But at the same time, I feel like if I'm making sense, I think like, we need to be looking forward. And I hope that, the groups that are now like operating in Syria, whether it's like the Kurds themselves, like, I'm not sure whether they will be able to like disentangle themselves from the United States, but or whether it's,
well,
whatever this government is, the Syrian Salvation Government, or whatever the civilian arm of HTS. I guess they're still kind of transitioning. I hope that they'll be able to not give in to their most craven instincts, even though tends to be the pattern. So,
yeah, a lot's up in the
and not let
air,
those stop them from, you know, yeah.
and it's not clear what the Trump administration is gonna sort of do. I
Did you
saw
see
him.
Trump's statement today? It was pretty funny.
Was it today, or I saw him talking about Erdogan yesterday? He was like,
Oh, it
he's a
was
very strong
yesterday. Yeah,
guy,
yeah, yeah. I
very
saw it
smart
today.
guy.
So, exactly. It's like Turkey is in control right now,
Yeah,
and that's okay. We
yeah,
don't want anything to do with it. Like they took over. It was a great thing for them. Like they're gonna hold the key to everything that happens, and
right.
that's fine. Yeah,
Yeah,
like
yeah. It was like
right.
it was interesting, and then yeah, Trump's like interact people in the Trump circles connections with Turkey is actually a very interesting kind of subject maybe to explore in the near future because it might reveal some things. You remember I sent you that thing about there was that court case about people connected to like our to James Woolsey and Michael Flynn and
Oh
Graham
yeah,
Fuller
right.
that were involved in some kind of like scam that involved Turkey, but also like giving like a CIA plan to like launder money to like give guns to the Kurds and like there's criminal prosecutions actually happening about it. And one of the guys actually, one of the Turkish like, international businessmen that was at the heart of the whole thing, I think his trial just got bumped like another year in the future, so that he could like testify in the Eric Adams Turkish corruption trial or something.
Hmm.
Oh, and you know what? They're connected with a polygamist sect of Mormons that are like a criminal empire in Utah. That was the thing too. Yeah. Yeah, no, honestly, there's some weird fucking shit there. That'd be a good episode to do in the near future.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, then of course, his DNI, she's been quoted in recent times emphasizing that Erdogan is not our friend because he's a
Hmm.
crazy Islamist and he wants to
Yes.
do Muslim everywhere. And of course, Tulsi is also a great friend of the Kurds. So I
Right.
think there might be
The whole
almost a
thing of
neocon
like,
split here a little bit,
yeah,
between the Kissingerian realpolitik of backing whatever Erdogan's doing, and kind of like why don't we let you handle that one, Jamal? Like,
yeah,
kind of like why don't we let you handle that one, Francois? But like kind of letting like let's let the Turks, they're NATO, right? Like let's let them kind of like be them, and Israel can kind of like handle the region on their own. We don't have to get involved. But then Tulsi is very much like, no, we love Israel and we love the heckin' Kurds. And so we should like use them as a proxy to resist. Like people miss that because everyone's talking about Tulsi and like they're gonna find the Assad file that's like Tulsi said, I love Assad. Like,
yeah,
and like they're gonna get her. But we'll see. We'll see if anything comes out. But I think she like us, she's focused on the future as well. And she's always got her eye on the main threat, which is,
yes.
Islamist extremism. So I think that she might kind of lobby Trump in a little more of a
Well, the thing
like,
is, like,
hey,
something we
let's
didn't
stick
really
around.
emphasize super hard in our Tulsi episode was that, like, the director of national intelligence, like, does the president's daily brief. Like,
Right. It's
so
kind of
she's
a
like the one
meta
who's like, here's what's
bureaucratic
going on in
role.
the
It's weird.
world, yeah, like,
Yeah.
so
She gets
that
to
is like,
filter his brief a little bit.
exactly. So it's
Mhm.
like, yeah. No, yeah, you're right. It's a meta bureaucratic role. So that is like kind of a worrying thing. But yeah, like this kind of like, I don't know, for lack of a better word, like Islamophobic kind of like foreign policy, like rhetoric, like really like sets off like my alarm bells. And I don't like it. Like just the other day, like I was reading, I posted about it on Twitter, but I saw this post by this guy. Did you see this? Like literally when I saw this, I didn't even know like who it was, but this is this tweet from this dude. His name is Seth Harp. And
Oh yeah,
he
I've heard
said,
that.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it took 19 years, but the Syrian state has been fully destroyed. There is no more Syria, just a hellhole crawling with gangsters and jihadists. This is the fate of any country that fucks with Israel. Iraq and Libya are no longer viable nation states either. Iran is next. And like, reading that, I was immediately just, I could tell that this was like kind of like a leftist, like temper tantrum. But like a lot of people in the comments like assumed that he was like a Zionist who was like just gloating about this because
Oh,
like
really?
that's exactly like how he sounds. Like he's just saying like there's, basically no one
There's
in
no
Syria is
hope.
human. They're all just gangsters and jihadists. Syria doesn't exist anymore. Like no,
Mm.
like there still is a Syria. There's still people there. A lot of the same people who were there 10 days ago.
I do
Like
see
this,
like I understand the kind of sentiment of like you need to understand how like grim this is and how there's a bad moon rising across the whole region and it's going to be bad and everything. But at the same time, yeah, there's a little doomer angle to it that
well, I
it
just think like
doesn't necessarily need to be there of
the
like man, it's so fucked. It's just so
I feel
fucked.
that
Like
like the
everything's
the
fucked.
the
Like
dehumanization
yeah,
angle
no,
and
I
like the
think that
negation
language,
of the
yeah.
sovereignty of Syria is something that like I feel like a lot of people are like kind of like falling into because like again it's sort of like a disorienting time, but I think that like people maybe should be more careful because like it does have like a little bit of an effect. If everyone is lockstep behind this idea that like this is a hellhole of jihadists and gangsters and there's like, no value there, like it's already basically given up for lost to being taken over by Israel, like then I just think that does have an effect. But what I wanted to
I can see
mention was
that's not
that
constructive.
that
Yeah.
guy, I recognize his name and I was like, what? Where have I seen that name before? And
Yeah,
it turns
he's a
out
Rolling
that
Stone guy.
yes, he is. And in fact,
Hmm.
he's the author of a very famous
Hmm.
article. Definitely famous, like in the kind of like Twitter left sphere. He did
Yeah.
a bunch of articles about like the Antifa battalion fighting in Syria, of
Right,
Western
right.
anarchists.
These were I remember these
Yeah.
actually being pretty optimistic articles about the Syrian Kurds and also like
Yeah, not your
relatively.
typical ethnic or sectarian faction. Its fighters are loyal to an imprisoned guerrilla leader who was once a communist, but now espouses the same kind of secular, feminist, anarcho-libertarianism as Noam Chomsky or the activists of Occupy Wall Street, which is like an incredibly sus sentence, which is basically like a recruiting ad.
Yeah,
for this
yeah.
group,
And I
so it's just
remember
like
this.
Occupy Wall Street, like fed up with Occupy, like come
Hmm.
on down to like,
It kind of was the
and
next
it's like,
big thing
well, why
after
do you think that
Occupy.
this, if you're upset about the situation, anyway,
I mean, I
but
think yeah, I think that like yeah, some of his articles were instrumental in getting like very active segments of kind of like the millennial left to like pick a horse in Syria and be like, you know
exactly,
what? Like
yes.
we can the Kurds are actually heckin' leftists and they're actually
And they've
dope.
end up picking the same horse. Like now they've been like kind of like, psyops basically into
And I
picking the
mean,
exact same horse as the US and Israel now.
right, right.
Like, and there
And
was a little bit of like, ambivalence back when Assad was still in power because you still had people who were kind of like, more sort of sober-minded, like communists who could like, or who actually would read. I mean, I don't want to
you mean
associate like, him with
Assadist
communism.
tankies who said that no, no, no. But that was a thing
Like,
back then. It was like that like if you get
no,
dogpiled for
I
being
remember being called like an Assad, which I'm definitely like now people are like, like I feel like people are angry at me for the opposite reason, but I remember at the time definitely being called like an Assadist like out of nowhere, which is
yeah.
like, it
That
like
was
at the
kind of a
time I was
camp.
like that's kind of yeah, like I didn't like even at the time I didn't really know anything about like tanky Twitter shit or anything like that. So like when people like, mostly I just knew my Muslim friends who like all hated Assad to be honest.
Right, right.
And like, Sunni Muslims like in Brooklyn, at my old masjid who like, like had family in Syria, like who were from Yemen, like who didn't like him,
Right,
and so
right.
to me, I
Yeah.
was like, what the fuck? Like, how dare you? Just because I don't support this like U.S. proxy army, you're saying I support this guy, like, and now I understand it more, like the sort of geopolitical, like kind of like real politique angle on Assad, which now we're
Yeah.
seeing, like where
But
there was kind of more of a, you know,
But
uh,
interestingly, in that discourse of that era, you would not get called an Assadist if you were standing the YPG, even though they have a much more explicitly, I mean, I don't that they're not like Marxist Leninists, but like they do come from that background. And, they're also like kind of promoting themselves as like super leftist, like, anarcho, whatever, like endorsed by Chomsky and stuff. But like no smoke in the mainstream media or from these like these kind of like NGO accounts that would always like target like Oz Katerji, maybe he's Turkish, so maybe he hates the YPG. But
mhm.
like in general, you wouldn't get a lot of like pushback from standing this group, despite the one awkward thing of like them pretty much being like backed by the US military, the Pentagon and the
Yeah,
CIA in their whole fight and like that and being like fully integrated, like especially in the SDF kind of era, but even before that, like going back to like 2015, 2016, it was very obvious like what was going on there. So I mean, I can sympathize with that journalist doomerism to some extent, but I think if we're gonna do a kind of roundup of like the positions taken during the Syrian war and do some like constructive self-crit, because I know I think this journalist has also written a lot of good investigative work about corruption in the U.S. military and generally is like an adversarial journalist to the military industrial complex, certainly not afraid to like
yeah.
expose corruption and like paint the U.S. military kind of in a properly nefarious light. But like I don't know, like an acknowledgement that that was like a not a based leftist thing to do was like so like it actually does matter if like a force, no matter what they say about themselves, or you could say the same thing about like HTS or some of these other groups that got a lot of foreign Western support and training and weapons and stuff like that. Like people got to
Nearly
you
as like directly as the
no, no,
SDF.
I
Like
mean,
the
in
thing,
the
like you could
SDF,
like
it
they
really
were
was
definitely
integrated.
their
Like,
goals kind of like aligned and they definitely were like useful like in certain ways like and there definitely was a point in like 2018 when the US like just stopped trying to kill Jelani because like they with their drones and everything like that
right,
or
right,
is it in 2018 I don't might have said
right, right.
but so like there's definitely like a little bit of like a line and there definitely were back channels as well as like I think have pretty much been acknowledged but like it's a like apples and oranges with the SDF like
Like, it's
you
not a
know
conspiracy. It's like completely wide open, and
yeah.
and
I
for
mean,
that
neither are
reason,
really like a conspiracy, like in the pejorative sense, both are like
no,
true, but
no.
like one is a bit like, more of a marriage of convenience, whereas the other one is like, they're literally like just a straight up proxy army and like they're embedded with them. Like, Whereas, yeah, it would have to be like a little more like back channels and like kind of like
Yeah.
tacit support. Yeah.
And the material impact of that like support wasn't just that like, well, they got to kill a lot of ISIS guys and stuff. I think, there were New York Times exposés about the Delta Force teams that were embedded with Kurdish units that were calling in airstrikes on their iPads and stuff, like during like the siege of Raqqa or something. They were killing like tens of thousands of people with like
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, they killed.
oftentimes like it almost is like probably not Gaza levels, but like intense levels of
Yes.
brutality in terms of the air war.
And this
just
is
calling
like-
in on like anybody that looked like they might be an
Yeah.
ISIS person, like
No, exactly.
in
And
a
this is,
village, just blow it
tons
all
of
up.
civilians. Like this is the kind of point that I'm like women and children.
Yeah.
This is the kind of point that I'm trying to make. Like, and it's hard because like I also like, I'm disgusted by like the actions of ISIS and of al-Nusra and like Al-Qaeda, obviously. I think that that's like this blasphemous, like it's awful, like it's a disgrace to my religion. However, the specter of like the sort of propaganda weapon of like the bloodthirsty, like basically like totally like dehumanized like Islamists, like especially for people who like are like, are kind of removed from it and are kind of like, as you said, like picking a horse, that like specter is used to like justify like that exact type of violence where it's like, oh, well, we're just getting the bad guys, like the demons. And it's like,
Yeah, those
it's
head
more-
choppers, which
exactly
is like,
like there's a whole spectrum. Yeah, the head choppers.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole like spectrum of people like who are gonna get blown up under the idea that like you're killing these. Like, there are like sociopaths like that who are evil and like who no one will mourn if they get blown up. But like there's also like a lot of people who are like there's everything between that guy, that sociopath, and like a newborn baby, and there's like everyone in between those two extremes.
Right.
Like people who like have no choice, people who are being
Yeah.
forced, people who
like Raqqa's a big city. It got conquered
Yeah.
by ISIS. It doesn't follow that that's Israeli logic that everybody in the area is like a terrorist and like you just have to blow them all up, like basically to be safe. Like,
Yeah.
it's the same logic, and just because they did it like leftistly allegedly but like not actually leftistly in a material sense. And then of course, the other big thing they do is they squat on all of Syria's domestic resources.
That's
so
a
that
huge
the
thing, and
central
that's like
that's a
what
huge
really
factor
needs to
in
happen
why
now,
Assad
like-
collapsed. That's a huge
Like-
factor why he collapsed, is because
Yeah.
they didn't really
And
export
it's also
oil,
a
but they
huge
had enough to
factor
use.
in like whether any new government in Syria that's sovereign will like be stable, is like whether they can get those oil resources back or if the US will
Right.
continue to like keep them like for
Because
whatever
it's
fucking
the
reason.
U.S. that
Yeah.
decides that, not the Kurds that are their partners. Like they're
Yeah,
just
and
there to be
that-
the soldiers, but like
that
they
is
don't
actually
make
an
those
important-
calls.
Yeah, and that's actually an important point I feel like to underscore in a way, is that like, and this is true of like a lot of people. It's not just like, people who like support the Kurds or whatever, or people who like were really all in on Assad and are kind of like more bemoaning his fall like in a big way, which like, again, is understandable. But like, I think all sorts of people, even the people I think who are now like running the government of Syria, such as it is, like don't haven't like put this together where it's like there's a continuity like between these things, like the sanctions, like if they were truly like, against like Assad, then as soon as he was gone, they would go away, obviously,
Sure.
because like but that's not what
but
that's not
that's
how they
not
work.
really what it's
Exactly.
about.
And if they, if the oil were really about like I guess protecting it from ISIS, I guess, but I guess that's the thing. Like it's like, oh well, actually, you guys are extremists, even though like you're doing everything that you can to bend over backwards to like appeal. Like no, there's never gonna buy that like in a million years. I understand like why they feel like they have to do it, and like why they feel like it's their best bet. But at the same time, like
for who to do what?
I feel like I understand why HCS is like kind of bending over backwards to like try to seem like harmless and like that they are gonna and I mean I think some of that is good, like in terms of like safeguarding the rights of minorities and things like that. I think actually it's important. They should do that.
It's very good
and
if
I
they
hope
don't
that they
do
will.
reprisal killings. Like that's
Yeah,
great.
exactly.
And
Not,
so far, I'm not like. I mean, there's definitely. I think there's been some isolated incidents of
there
like
definitely
units doing that, but
there has been stuff like it's not been what like people
mass
like
slaughter.
some people have like yeah, some people immediately predicted it hasn't been like that. But
Yeah, and clearly
and
he's been shown the light in terms of like how to present yourself to like particularly Western international audiences
yeah,
in
he
a way
read
that,
Why Nations Fail. He yeah, exactly.
and
Um, he
like
took the institutions pill,
like
and yeah,
I'm skeptical, but at the same time, like I mean, I think like
I
the
think
sort of
the
like
only
position of
reasonable
Iran right now
thing,
to like kind of step back and like not say anything too
yeah,
rash either way about it, and just be like, well, we're cool to work with you, like
yeah,
constructively, like we don't have to be enemies, and then if they did they take that olive branch or do they I'm sure there's going to be a lot of pressure from international, maybe Gulf sources, Western sources to be like, you guys need to break up, like, make it official that like Syria is a no-go zone for Iranian interests and things like that. I'm sure there'll be pressure on them to do that, right? And there's probably be Turkish pressure for I'm not sure whatever their interests are. And then there's the looming kind of Israeli menace in the
probably
south
to go
that
after to like try to neutralize the PKK will be a big like desire of
I think
Turkey.
that's what they're going to want.
Um,
Like, let us take out the Kurds, and that's what I think Turkey's going to ask
exactly.
America the same thing. They're going to be like, "Oh, get like Trump says he wants to get out of the region. Let us just like wipe out these motherfuckers, and then let us take over like the oil, or let people backed by us take it over,
Yeah.
And then you'll have a nice little NATO proxy there, and that's not pissing off your other NATO neighbor because that was always the tricky thing with the Kurds, right? Is like and that's oftentimes like thrown out as like a reason why they're not sus is like, well, Turkey's in NATO and they hate the Kurds because they're so revolutionary. And
Yeah.
like, I don't know. Like, I'm not going to confess to be an expert upon like Kurdish oppression within Turkey.
No,
It
yeah. I
certainly
mean, they
seems as
have a
if like
legitimate
they have
grievance. Like
legitimate
but I mean,
grievances
you
as
can
a
say the
national
same thing
minority.
about like Al Qaeda in Iraq. Like they had like they had some legitimate grievances. Like their
Right.
tactics are not good a lot of the time. Like that's the problem. Like if their issue was like, oh, there's American imperialism, but your solution is like we're gonna go like bomb civilians like in Europe or in Iraq, we're gonna do commit these like that's the issue. Like Turkey's not necessarily wrong that like they use terrorist tactics,
They
or
do.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
but again, like
They did
again,
a mass shooting last year, I think,
Turkey
at like a
also
drone
targets civilians.
factory.
The U.S. targets
Of
civilians.
course.
God
Yeah.
knows Israel targets civilians. So but they have like a legitimate a grievance, and I like definitely.
I mean, I think if people
But
think that their armed
the
like
idea that like
struggle
they're
against Turkey is
revolutionary because like that's the
like
thing. Like Turkey is like yeah they are in NATO, but they're not like the most like cozily
right,
situated in NATO. I mean, I remember reading like not too long ago about like the whole issue around like they bought I forget what the name of it is, but they bought like Russia's air defense system
right, like the
and like
S-400. Yeah.
yeah, wow. Well, I'm surprised you know the name of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow, good
People
like
talk about it a lot.
good OSINT type
Yeah. I follow all the Telegram
knowledge.
channels, I know.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, they bought that like a while ago in Israel, like, and they were all supposed to get the F-35s, but
Hmm.
like Israel got like pissed off, and I think the
Mm.
US might have gotten a little bit pissed off too, because like that would give like Russia somehow, because of their air defense, like that would give them knowledge of the F-35s if like they had both.
Right.
I don't really understand why, because I don't know enough about military technology, but I understand that that was a
They share
concern.
military
Uh,
technology, so there's like anxiety around them
exactly.
trading
Yeah.
tech with each other. Same with Iran has like advanced
Yeah.
drones and
Right.
Russia like often hands that out as like if you're a good friend with them, they'll give you the S-400s, and
Yeah.
then which are pretty good, I think, at stopping like air assaults and stuff. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
presumably Assad did not have S-400s because Israel was bombing the shit out of him for like over a year, and he like kind of couldn't do anything about it, or felt like he couldn't do anything about it because he was so starved by, the U.S. proxies not letting him kind of rebuild his country, which kind of made this whole situation sort of inevitable. Like, there's not really any way to win out of it except a slow chokehold, that just keeps your country like a failed state, and like no regime is going to be stable under those circumstances if it just keeps going on forever. But I
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a
But
lot is probably going to happen.
yeah, we'll
Israel v
see.
Turkey. I don't know. Like,
If only I like we need the Ottoman spirits like awaken in Erdogan's heart and for him to just like real like but again, that's like really hoping for a miracle. Like genuinely a miracle for him to like actually like assert himself to stop their expansion and stop like their genocide in Palestine.
Once again, that would
Because, and I
bring
mean,
that
that's
would
the thing.
almost
Like, they're gonna
be.
do the same thing in Syria. Like, they're not gonna like, just like rule or like occupy it. Like, eventually they're already starting to like kind of expel people.
I saw
You know,
videos
like
of like the sort of hilltop youth or like the
it's
Chabad people
inevitable.
like going and like reciting prayers in like the Syrian Golan Heights and saying like we're gonna build like settlements here. It's gonna be so great. Like
Yeah,
thank God,
yeah.
and like that is. I mean, they're
It's
gonna do this like manifest destiny speed
it's an
run.
and
I
then yeah,
think
then obviously there's going to be like an armed resistance, and then obviously they're going to be like, oh, well, we got to defend ourselves by
gonna
committing
kill
more
all of you.
genocide.
Yeah,
Exactly.
brutally punish anybody who like resists us, and then
So someone needs to stop that. Yeah,
well,
and
going back to what you said, the lack of unity is like fatal to any idea of resistance because as long as you have, Sunnis and Shias like butting heads or working at cross purposes, or say that the Turks like working at their own agenda, and then the Arabs and the Iranians working on their own agenda, like Israel can just sort of like pick fights with them one by one, and then
yeah,
they never get like overwhelmed, even though they love saying how surrounded they are, but they like know that nobody's actually going to gang up and like do a kind of coordinated defense or attack them for there'll just be these little pockets like in Yemen, which might be about to be bombed heavily. It's one of the last outposts of like that was actually effective, if you think about it.
yeah,
Like one of the one of the most effective things since October 7th, it's just disrupting their trade. There's a lot of ways to like that you could, disrupt them even non-militarily, but they are on a hot streak right now, and you know I don't know. Like, I wonder, does the U.S. think just like Turks, Israelis, and I don't know. I feel like they have to choose between Kurds and Turks in terms of having a new kind of top client in the region, because like the Turks seem kind of like maybe down to even do that, but their one condition is that the U.S. has to like sacrifice the Kurds. And then are the Kurds like big enough? Is that too? Even with all the chaos happening, like trying to actually do like a Kurdistan thing, I feel like, that's when Turkey might get involved kind of directly to try to stop that. And
yeah,
I'm sure the Iraqi government, as weak as it is, like wouldn't appreciate like northern Iraq breaking
yeah.
off
Nor
and
would like people in Syria probably
right,
because they
right.
probably want like all those resources that are in quote
Yeah,
unquote Kurdistan.
they get to steal
Yeah,
like the oil and agricultural regions, from
yeah,
Syria to make it even weaker and effectively partition it like, through secession, like chop it in half because that's a lot of territory. So, I don't know what move is the US going to kind of go with, or do they think they can kind of balance these two forces of, Israel and Turkey kind of chop like rearrange doing the a kind of Sykes-Picot Reloaded, where
yeah,
you have your NATO ally and your settler colonial outpost, chopping up the boundaries in ways that make sense for them and also don't offend like U.S. The interests of the U.S. and its allies. There's all those pipeline projects they always used to talk about, from like Qatar, they wanted to do that Assad didn't want to do. And that was always like an undercurrent thing with overthrowing Assad, I feel like. Kind of got lost in the mix, like throughout the craziness of the war. But I feel like that's something that they're probably going to be exploring now. And I'm sure Israel would like to kind of like get in on that too,
yeah.
if they have more territory. So, and it also
And
possibly
I
disrupts
think
the Belt and
Turkey would
Road.
probably like to control that themselves if they could.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
I
probably
bet they
like an
would.
interest in like
Yeah,
a
and then
Qatar pipeline
And then
pipeline
the
to
EU
Turkey.
has buy-in because like then they can get that gas. They don't have to get gas from Russia or
Yeah,
way far away from the US. They can get it up from the Middle East that way. So then even though the US probably wants to sell them natural gas, it's still kind of like a strategic win to get Europe its gas from anywhere that's like not Russia, and basically give them the sort of energy independence to be like, fuck you, Putler, which is like what they've been doing right now. So I don't know. It seems like a lot of dark moves being made on the global
yeah.
stage. and a lot of things very
Definitely.
fast.
Yes, and
But
definitely like a lot of I'm not. I mean, anyone who listens to the show knows I'm not the biggest optimist, even though like you try to be. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic for sure. But again, you gotta hope for the best, and you gotta have tawakkul, that it'll work out.
this is a part of a very long story. It's been going on now for over a century. And I think some of the stuff,
definitely for over a century. Yeah.
some of the stuff we want to get into today even concerns Syria under the French
I'm not
mandate.
sure if we'll get to it now. Yeah.
Oh yeah, maybe we won't do that today, but
we will eventually. I do want to talk about this book. We talked about it a little bit before about the Jewish agency in Syria during what they call the Arab Revolt. The Arab Revolt in Palestine. That
the
book
1936 Arab Revolt.
Yes, exactly.
Not to be confused with the World War I revolt.
Kind of confusing terminology. Probably should call it, as I was saying, the 1936 revolt, which is kind of distinct. Although it has some of the same players as the one we talked about earlier, it is a distinct thing. But yeah, it is interesting to see. And this is kind of what I'm talking about, where and this is part of the sort of discourse, that affects things even now. We were just talking about, right? Like there's kind of this idea of Palestine versus Syria, right? And that factors into Hezbollah as well, whereas for many Syrians, many Syrian Sunnis, whether they're rightly or wrongly, just as the sort of an exigency of the political landscape, which in many ways was sort of set in stone by the events of this period that we're talking about, the early 20th century, and as it carried into the Syrian civil war, they didn't like Hezbollah, and they had, as you said, kind of undermined their image, and so but Hezbollah was they actually fought a war with Israel, to defend Palestine, which no Sunni power did. So
right. And they didn't go all out this time, but
Syria
they did
versus
stuff.
Palestine,
they did stuff after October 7th,
and it becomes a thing. Well, they did. They fought. I know. Again, you could be underwhelmed, but especially compared to others, But
and also I guess it's worth noting that they did decimate their leadership. They killed Nasrallah and they did the beeper attacks and stuff. But in terms of, time will tell if it was a planned, if they really wanted to go in and take territory in southern Lebanon. But if that was their plan, they definitely failed miserably at that. Because a lot of IDF soldiers got killed and they pretty much got no territory before they signed that ceasefire thing, right?
Yeah.
And I feel they're very good at asymmetrical assassinations and air power shit and mass murdering civilians. But when it comes to actually tactical military confrontation with Hezbollah, they were not actually that good at it. You know, they weren't that effective. And again, it might be that was kind of a distraction from the main show of like killing all the leadership and then like I don't know, pivoting to now we're going to take a little Syria next, you know, or something like that. And then maybe if they get that territory in Syria, they can like invade sideways into Lebanon or some, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, you know, they're not invincible and they
No,
have their
they're
limits
definitely not invincible.
and
They're
it's all
definitely
backed
not
up by
invincible.
American weapons. So
Yeah, like, and
like
this goes back to the Turkey thing, like someone like a power that has leverage with NATO. Again, like I cringe at myself like expressing like any kind of hope that like anything like this could happen because it's like a slim possibility, and so far, like, you know, it's not been an impressive like, you know, in recent years it hasn't been an impressive really since the time we've been talking about, like, Turkey has been fucking up and like has not been conducting itself in a way that anyone would admire or appreciate. But they do actually have like the leverage, and they have like the resources that, like, if there were to be like a Sunni resistance axis, you know, that would like be a decent sponsor like for groups like Hamas, you know. But
mm,
again, is that going to happen? Probably not. Yeah. And
yeah,
like I don't
yeah.
understand why again it even has to be like a sectarian thing, you know, but unfortunately it's just how things have not really it's not just how things have shaken out, it's kind of how things were designed, as we'll talk about. But yeah, what I was saying was that it becomes this thing of like you know, Palestine versus Syria, you know, where like their sort of perception of Hezbollah, for instance, or even Iran, or even of al-Assad, like that's kind of, people will be like, well, you know, his being there, like that helped Iran, which helps Palestine. And then people will be like, well, but like, what about all these, you know, things he did to Syria? And so it kind of creates this opposition between the two when, again, in an ideal world, and if it weren't for the events that we're talking about now and the way that this region was carved up and the way these things were deliberately undertaken, for instance, by the Jewish agency in Syria in the 30s, it wouldn't be the case. But yeah, we will talk about that shortly, because there's some interesting stuff like, you know, the Zionist disinformation campaign in Syria and Lebanon during the 1936 revolt, the negotiations between the Jewish agency and the National Bloc in Syria. A lot of it having like big resonances with what like we're actually kind of seeing now during this like period of uncertainty, I feel like.
In terms of
So
dividing different power
yeah,
blocks,
trying to
um,
pit each other, like, you know,
pit
yeah,
them
trying to
against
pit
each other.
factors against each other. Yeah, trying to like cultivate alliances, the relations between the Jewish agency and Druze leaders. You know, I don't know if
Yeah.
a lot of people saw this kind of like wish casting about like the Druze wanting to like split off from Syria and join Israel, which like was, again, like, speaking of like Twitter stuff, this is something
Mm.
that I've been wanting to emphasize, is like, you have to understand that like Israel is definitely like hammering out some of these stories, and that is one of them. The idea that like the Druze actually want to join Israel, you know, like you know, that's
Oh
just my
yeah,
my
no, they like
take.
to
Like,
say
that's
that
some
because
bullshit.
it's
Yeah.
like a tiny
Um,
minority they can kind of point to and be like, "See, we're not
exactly.
like a you know ethno supremacist state. Like, look at these guys,
Yeah.
look at these Jews over here. Like, they love us."
Yes. And it's
Um,
definitely not true that like they want to be ruled, but like, you know, except for maybe you can find someone anywhere who will say anything, you
you can
know,
find a
but like
handful of
it's
Arab
definitely not
Israeli
like,
citizens that'll be like, "Yeah, I have rights." Like, you know, like you can
exactly, yeah.
always
You can
dig up a
find
couple people here and there.
someone somewhere who will say literally anything about anything, but like making that out to be like representative. But yeah, so you can see this sort of continuation of the policy that we saw during the sort of pre-mandate period and the Ottoman period of kind
Hmm.
of you know, taking advantage of these minorities and using them like as a wedge. You know, we see
Yeah,
that
a
kind of
little
being
divide
taken
and
up.
conquer.
But
Yeah.
yes, exactly. On that point, you know, I read this article that was kind of interesting side note. And this also occurred to me like kind of as a parallel phenomenon to the sectarianism. Kind of, and you definitely do see this today being used like both by imperial discourses as kind of a way to attempt to drive a wedge, and something that actually does definitely drive a wedge in politics in like the Arab world broadly, especially among Muslims. Like I read this article by Ellen Fleischman, the
Hmm.
emergence of the Palestinian women's movement in 1929 and 1939.
Okay.
And it brings up, there's some like very interesting figures who come up in this, like Sadij Nassar, who was she was the wife of the editor of Al Carmel, which we kind of mentioned before. That was the magazine that Wasif Joharia read about the Great Britain's plans, and he sort of read that poem that sort of, and he kind of riffed off of it into a song. And yeah, she was like an early leader in kind of like a women's protest movement that kind of emerged out of the 1929 Wailing Wall thing, which we want to talk about,
Yeah.
in a
We'll do
broader
a
way than we
close
have before.
examination of it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. We talked about it a little bit with relation to the Mufti, but I think it's good to get it a little bit broader. But yeah, so she was involved in kind of women's demonstrations around that. And but what I wanted to mention with regard to this article was that the approach that the mandate government took to this was that they often tried to encourage, like they didn't try to intervene or suppress these protests themselves, because they kind of became like a media thing, like, even in the West, and like there was a sort of optics to it. But
Right.
what they did was, so for instance, like they, planned to have like an Arab Women's Congress to protest, some of these events that were happening in 1929 that we'll talk about in a little bit. And the week before the Congress, the organizers had announced their intention to demonstrate at Government House, but the High Commissioner intervened, attempting to enlist some of the Muslim leaders to dissuade the women from holding the demonstration.
Mm.
At first, the men declined to intervene, but after the government threatened to stop the demonstration by force, they arranged to have it take place, though without any speeches, in automobiles, following a set itinerary and accompanied by policemen and soldiers. And
Mhm.
it is consistently where, like, their response to women's mobilization was usually like not to intervene directly, but it was try to get the Arab men to intervene.
Mm.
Um, yeah,
Okay.
like in 1936 as well, the government trying to prevent the Jaffa AWA from holding a meeting, they delegated officials to negotiate not with the women, but with the male National Committee. Its attempt to force the National Committee to prevent the public from mixing with the women when they entered and exited the meeting backfired, and a massive demonstration went forward. But it doesn't always backfire, I think, especially in the present day. It's something to bear in mind as well. But yeah, so telescoping out a little bit, let's maybe talk
Okay.
about 1929, because it is important. Like we were
Yeah, it's a
kind of
pretty
thinking,
pivotal year.
yeah, like and a lot of like the groundwork for what would come in the ensuing decades was laid in 1929.
Hmm.
Um,
Definitely. But particularly the conflict between, Palestinian Arabs and Jewish settlers, the Zionists. Like
yeah. Well, and
it,
really yeah. Yeah, and the definitely like aspects of the conflict, but also like, the perception of it, and the idea of partition, basically.
mhm.
I mean, certainly like the fact that the flashpoint was the Western Wall, which we see as being such an important like symbol in the politics of Palestine and Israel, like now,
Mhm.
like that is definitely something that resonates, but also like it seems like yeah, I read this one interesting article. Let me see if I can find it. That was like about the idea of cantonization that kind of proliferated then. Like previously, like there had been sort of this notion that maybe they would have cantons of some, like kind of like they have in like federated regions, like in
Okay.
Switzerland. Like
Right,
that was
right.
how they would end up doing this. But after the riots, there was this kind of shift where this is going to have to be, obviously, we're going to have to partition in some way, and sort of the plans for the partition became more prominent. But yeah, I'm trying to think where to start here. Maybe we could start with this article. This is kind of an old one, but it's
Mhm.
still like pretty useful. It's called Wall Politics, Zionist and Palestinian Strategies in Jerusalem, 1929. Did
Okay.
you look at this one?
I didn't get to,
Um,
but I can pull it up now.
yeah, might be cool. Yeah, it's by Mary Ellen Lunsden. This is a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. And she writes, Benedetto Croce noted that all history has the character of contemporary history, because however remote in time events they are recounted may seem to be, the history in reality refers to present needs and present situations wherein those events vibrate. True.
Mhm.
Exactly 50 years ago, late in September 1928, an incident occurred at the Western Wall of the Holy Sanctuary in Jerusalem, which set in motion a sequence of violent events that clearly, quote unquote, vibrate, as Croce put it, in political situations and judgments today. The Western, or quote unquote, Wailing Wall controversy, which became a public issue in 1928, triggered the intercommunal violence that in 1929 claimed 800 casualties and marked a shift of the political process in Palestine into the irreconcilably violent phase which continues today. Recent discussions of the quote unquote present needs of a Middle East peace settlement. So bear in mind this article is from 1978. So that's the context that this is all being talked about. So like I said, it's a little bit dated, but it's still interesting to read, especially like kind of in historical context. But yeah, so recent discussions of the present needs of a Middle East peace settlement offer little to dispute Croce's observation. Those which reject the possibility and/or acceptability of a democratic secular state in all of Palestine often refer back to the intercommunal violence of the Mandate era as proof of the unworkability of a common solution, in which Palestinian Arabs and Jews live amongst each other and constitutionally guarantee to each other certain communal rights. Several treatments which espouse the Zionist solution with or without expansion of the 1967 borders give a markedly monocular view of the incidents and pronouncements which occurred in Jerusalem when Zionists and Palestinian Arabs first clashed openly over control of, quote unquote, the wall. As a prologue to his romanticized account of Irgun terror, J. Bowyer Bell indulged first in a blatantly distorted version of the actual outbreak of the violence in 1929 and proceeded to justify the Irgun by implying that fanatic Arab leaders had initiated the abstruse wrangle over Jewish control of the wall ex nihilo and had joined with like-minded British officials to incite ignorant Muslim mobs into anti-Jewish violence. And that's basically like your standard Zionist historiography of this whole thing that what she just described, like this idea, and it kind of emerges out of the way that the British Mandate talked about at the time, right? Like they really kind of perceive this as being like, well, first of all, they perceived like Arabs as Muslims foremostly. And that's another kind of wedge they tried to drive because like a lot of these resistance movements were like heavily Muslim and Christian and non-sectarian. But like they really, in dealing with them and positioning them, right, just in the way they acted, like Haj Amin al-Husseini, who we talked about, was like the main representative of the Palestinian national movement, gave him this made-up title of Grand Mufti, like, and emphasized so much Jerusalem in their understanding of the sort of Palestinian national identity, like that, shows how, like, I mean, not to say it's not important to Christians as well, but Al-Aqsa, like this, it just,
yeah, it's a big deal.
Took on kind of a Muslim character, right? Their idea of what, the Palestinian national movement was or what the Palestinian resistance was.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Not to minimize that too much, but yeah. What were you gonna say?
Oh no, I'm just saying like the moving forward about the Wailing Wall incident.
So these accounts by no means represent a scholarly consensus on the wall incident, nor are they based on the best available historical evidence. After scrutinizing centuries of travelers' notations and consulting colonial office files for the earliest years of the British occupation, A.L. Tabawi has painstakingly analyzed the issue from what he acknowledges is the Arab-Muslim point of view. More recently, Ibrahim Dakak, under the auspices of the Arab Thought Forum in Jerusalem, noted the ways in which Israeli measures adopted since 1967 towards the annexation of Jerusalem, taking control over the wall and establishing fixtures for public worship, expropriating 116 dunams of Arab property near the wall, stationing Israeli soldiers at the wall, expelling 10,000 Arab residents from their homes in the city, and destroying the homes of the entire Mughrebi quarter next to the wall, fulfill the earlier attempts of Zionist leaders to expand their control of Jerusalem's old city. Echoing these earlier efforts in a manner especially alarming to Muslims are the frequent incidents since 1967 in which militant youths and exuberant generals have tried to establish by prescription the Jewish right to group worship inside the Haram al-Sharif and to conduct archaeological digs which endanger ancient Islamic buildings, at a time when the Israeli military government had established censorship over the sermons given in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Certain legal ruling by Israeli courts have been equivocal on the issue of rights which can be exercised inside the haram. Wall politics seem to be very much a part of the current antagonism between occupier and occupied, and it is not surprising that, as Croce would remind us, the interpretations which the various historians give to the incidents of 50 years ago are closely tied to the solutions which they recommend for the larger political problems, which include the disposition of Jerusalem and the nature of the entities to be constituted as a solution to the Israel/Palestine conflict. So yeah, she says entity slash entities, because will it be one state, will it be two?
Right.
Israeli retention of at least the wall and plaza is put forth as a minimum requisite by Zionists whose solution to the wider conflict takes as minimal the 1949 borders with minor rectifications. and a Jerusalem restored to its fundamentally Arab characteristics is envisioned by those who retain the hope for a democratic secular state liberated from Zionist control. Thus, to Arab and Israeli political leaders, as well as policymakers elsewhere who seek sponsorship of a peace settlement, the battle for the wall and the manner in which it has been waged are inescapable issues of contemporary history. The political stakes underlying the wall issue in 1928 to 1929 were discussed at the time by the Arab and Zionist presses, both of which saw in the struggle a microcosm of the wider contest over Palestine's future. Related to the broader aspect of the issue are the judgments which the younger members of both communities will make about the leaders of their grandparents' generations. Among the Palestinian youth, the verdict has partially been given that the traditional nationalists who led the political battle of the Mandate era were clearly unprepared to face the sophisticated quote unquote power politics of the Zionist imperial alliance, which was deciding the fate of their country. More recently, the dependence of that traditional Arab elite on their imperial overlords and by derivation on their Zionist conquerors has been emphasized. Very interesting, especially in a contemporary context, right? She was thinking about this in the 1978 context, but like this really makes sense today. And I can't help but think about it in the context of Syria, and in particular with respect to Jolani himself, actually. Maybe this is just on my mind, but I'm thinking about sort of the contrast between his father, Hussein al-Shara, and Jolani, who's actually Ahmed al-Shara.
Who's from the Golan Heights originally,
Yeah, well,
right?
his family is,
His
he
family is.
lived the first
He was
years of his
born
life in
in
Saudi,
Saudi
actually.
originally,
Yeah, but then he did go back to Syria for much of his childhood. But yeah, you can actually see kind of that defining conflict between Islamism, Islamist politics, the Muslim Brotherhood,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which
Yeah.
was definitely taking shape during this time as an organization, and the sort of Arab nationalism, right? Those two conflicting paradigms.
Which I feel
Kind
like
of
the
echoing.
Ba'athist
Yeah.
states would sort of inherit the Arab nationalist kind of
Yeah, they were
yeah.
they were
And
theoretically.
that
Yeah,
even
yeah,
went
yeah.
through to, Hafez Assad and his sort of battle against Muslim Brotherhood within
Yeah, there's
Syria, like in the
definitely
80s.
tension. Yes,
Yeah,
yes, yes,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Like yeah, unfortunately they ended up I mean, I think you can say that they were themselves pretty sectarian, and that was part of the problems that they ended up having. But yeah, definitely Baathism in general. There were unique qualities to the implementation of Baathism in Syria, as there were in Iraq as well, and things like that. But
For
yeah,
sure.
theoretically, it shouldn't have should be based on Arab solidarity, right?
Yeah.
But during the first decade of the British mandate over Palestine, is the majority of the Palestinian leaders, including Haj Amin al-Husseini, refused to legitimize the mandate system and especially the Balfour Pledge, which had been interwoven into that system. But by accepting official positions, they had to work within the constraints of a British Zionist bargaining setting. And they had to develop strategies and devise negotiating tactics on a complex of political and social quote unquote games for which the previous experiences had ill equipped them. Furthermore, by retaining the paternal mode of leadership and sharing their imperial protector's desire for public order, they denied themselves the militance of mass action, which began in the next decade to transform the game itself. To Palestinian young people who have difficulty obtaining access to their own history, it is especially important to provide a more comprehensive treatment of the hostilities engendered by the wall incident. Such a view must include the activities conducted on both sides of the wall issue. Incidents like the wall dispute are of general interest to theorists who, by studying a variety of complex settings, hope to explain the dynamic process by which a specific incident triggers violent confrontation between two communities living amongst each other. To explore such dynamics systematically requires investigating the values and factional structure of the contending communities, the relationship between the communities and the external authority that has operative control over them, and the strategies employed by leaders of the opposing communities. The bargaining strategies and factional influence that are deducible from a formal theory of social conflict are clearly discernible in the events connected with the Western Wall controversy. Incidents drawing the wall issue directly into the Arab Zionist political struggle arose immediately after the Balfour Declaration was issued to Lord Rothschild. But it was not until 1928 that claims on the wall came to pose an open test of the Arab and Zionist leaders' strategies. The process of community interaction triggered by the wall dispute is treated in the sections of this article according to three phases of bargaining activity. One, the generally discreet lobbying on the issue by Zionist officials, and the Arab blocking strategy, which was largely successful during the initial decade of the controversy. Two, the expansion of the issue in the fall of 1928 into a cause célèbre among Zionist militants who were countered by Muslim officials defending the status quo. And three, the intensification of the wall issue into a mass confrontation which Zionist militants used to test Britain's overall adherence to the Balfour policy. The last section will conclude the article with some observations on the contrasting strategies pursued by Zionist and Arab leaders. So, yeah, it gives like a little bit of background on the issue of the wall, and how it was kind of raised at different points in some of the sort of events we talked about, right? Like in the spring of 1921 in London, Sir Alfred Mond, then Minister of Health in the British cabinet, and as one of London's wealthiest Jews, a source of funding for many of the Zionist large-scale capital projects in Palestine, addressed the Palestine Foundation Fund with an appeal for a new edifice to be erected where Solomon's ancient temple once stood. The speech was reported in the Daily Telegraph and was reiterated in a parliamentary note with the help of his official friends, Under Secretary of State William Ormsby Gore and High Commissioner Herbert Samuel. Mond's reference to the temple site was later dismissed as "quote unquote" figurative speech. Then we talked about the 1921 incidents, right?
They mention here a little bit about Zeev Jabotinsky, or nay Vladimir, and how he was pretty active early on in kind of agitating around the wall, I guess. And the Arabs were pretty clear, I think, pretty much from like the beginning of the mandate, that they don't want any change in the status of the holy places. So they say that Zionist political concern for the wall issue was kept alive by members of Vladimir Jabotinsky's Jewish battalions, who staged public marches to the wall in defiance of a British order to the contrary and provoked street fighting with Arab passers-by. Finally, the British military government conducted a court-martial against the militant settlers and ordered their units disbanded. So then they say a little more about Jabotinsky. For the next few years, as British civilian rule was being established over Palestine, Jabotinsky worked within the framework of official Zionist agencies, first in the Zionist Commission and then the London Zionist Executive. He was less interested in religious affairs than in securing maximum Zionist political objectives, including the establishment of a regular Jewish army in Palestine and Zionist colonization of Transjordan. It's the both sides of the Jordan River thing. During these years, it was the, quote, moderate Zionist leadership, rather than Jabotinsky, who stimulated hopes in the international Jewish community that Jewish religious sites in Jerusalem could be rebuilt. The Jewish National Fund issued stamps and booklets portraying Jewish symbols at the wall and signifying the relationship between Jewish jurisdiction over the holy places and Zionist land acquisition throughout Palestine. In New York, during the first year of British civilian rule in Jerusalem, a newspaper publicizing the Zionist program reproduced a tourist card on which Theodor Herzl was positioned next to the Dome of the Rock, over which the Zionist flag was flying. So, yeah, you see, Jabotinsky, eventually he becomes like a huge
he pops
factor.
up a lot like around this whole issue. Like he's all over it. He definitely becomes even more relevant and some of the other stuff that we read.
Kind of the number one chaos agent of the Zionist movement, even, fighting a lot inside of it, but also like stimulating things to happen, like a real active individual, right?
Yeah,
and an extreme individual.
This author's kind of woke. Like I like, the way she phrases it, like, this part. Accordingly, the Zionist executive resorted to an incrementalist strategy while continuing to rely upon a quote unquote dirty tricks fund supplied by the Palestine Zionist executive and quote unquote Jimmy parentheses Rothschild, who in turn was a confidant of quote unquote Billy Ormsby Gore and Jabotinsky.
Oh my God,
After this fund was first Jimmy Rothschild. After this fund was first authorized by Weizmann, it was used, among other purposes, to undermine the Supreme Muslim Council, to try to divide Muslims from Christians in the association led by the Arab Executive Committee, to discredit Haj Amin al-Husseini, to help secure resource concessions for Zionist activists such as Pinhas or Peter Rutenberg, and to equip and train the militant Haganah units, which Jabotinsky, Rutenberg, Weizmann, and Rothschild all actively promoted from the earliest days of the British occupation. And Jabotinsky was like this leading kind of Zionist revisionist, right? There was these kind of two camps, right? So, Jabotinsky and Ushishkin, who I think we also talked about before.
Ushishkin,
right? Yeah. Descended from the gradualist tactics approved by the Zionist executive after 1922, Jabotinsky shifted his focus to Central and Eastern Europe, where he began organizing his own revisionist political network. In Palestine during the years of Jabotinsky's absence, Zionist efforts to improve the Jewish position at the Western Wall were given relatively little publicity. Although incidents similar to those which had earlier inflamed Muslim opinion recurred, the connection between these incidents and Zionist political goals were rarely emphasized in Zionist circles. As Jewish employment floundered and immigration declined, economic concerns preoccupied the movement. But Jabotinsky's followers were involved in a few incidents which kept the issue alive. In December 1925, Jewish religious officials attempted to use benches and seats during the worship at the wall, but they acquiesced when the Palestine government upheld Muslim objections. Next, a disbanded Jewish battalion decided to move the Zionist flag from London to the main synagogue in Jerusalem, where they announced it would be kept until it could be taken again to the wall. Late in 1926, after one of the Mughrabi residents had cleared weeds from the interstices of the wall's stones, the Zionists objected. They argued that since the government antiquities department had already taken charge of the sections of stone within the boundaries of the wall where they worshipped, the entire length should be put under government charge as well. On several occasions, police were called in to investigate Zionist charges that the Mughrabi residents were stoning and assaulting Jewish worshippers. The police investigation showed that on one occasion a stone had been thrown by a child. Wow.
Wow.
Ain't nothing new, as we often say. Really from within one of the Mughrabi houses. On another, it was learned that pigeons nesting in the crevices had dislodged fragments of stone.
Wow.
Not long after these reports were filed, the Haganah claimed credit for the bombing of an Arab home near the wall. Haganah leaders cited Arab harassment as justification for the bombing.
Oh my God.
Wow. All right.
Wall
I need
politics.
a second to recover from that because I hadn't read that paragraph before now.
Jesus.
Yeah, so there you go. It really ain't nothing new. Partly because of the Zionist piecemeal tactics in which the wall issue had been treated as a matter of confessional rights, it was the Muslim Religious Office rather than the Palestine Arab Executive which was brought into the conflict as a spokesman for Arab rights. The Supreme Muslim Council, headed by the very young Haj Amin al-Husseini, formed the main opposition to Zionist initiatives at the Western Wall. The council's strategy in the face of Zionist moves during the early years of the mandate was a threefold mixed defense, or what conflict theorists would term a Maximin strategy, necessitated by British political ties to Zionism. As a first step, the council planned measures to reinvigorate the Muslim presence in Jerusalem and thereby refute Zionist charges that the Muslims had little regard for their holy places. From 1923, the council sponsored a series of appeals to Muslims throughout Africa and Asia to help finance, among other projects, the structural repairs they had begun in the Haram area. They also hoped to establish a new Muslim university, which would re-emphasize Jerusalem as a center for Muslim scholarship. Just to be, probably people know, but I could see it maybe being confusing to some, because they're familiar with the term haram as meaning forbidden, but same thing, sanctified,
Oh, okay. It's the sanctified area. The special area.
Mecca is also a haram. It's a sacred area.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So, as a second component of their strategy, Muslim officials registered protests with the government of Palestine whenever they discovered Jewish officials introducing prohibited devotional items into prayers at the Western Wall. A telegram sent by Muslims to Jamal al-Husseini, the council's secretary, on July 15, 1922, had asked him to keep the Muslim leadership alert to the defense of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Haram area. The Supreme Muslim Council's annual report for the year 1922 to 23 thereupon recalled that the Barak site was the property, again, that's Muhammad's steed that he rode. He flew from Medina to Jerusalem, or from Mecca to Jerusalem. A famous thing, but these sort of uprisings are also known as the Barak uprisings. It was this property of the Al-Guth Abu Madian Waqf, and the Muslim indulgence of individual Jewish needs during prayer had been used as a pretext for false claims of jurisdiction. So, there were all these sort of political things. And then there was one last strategic element, which was Muslim leaders joined the Arab executive in repeatedly objecting to the legal control that the Attorney General Norman Bentwich exercised over Arab property and civil rights. From the beginning of the mandate, Bentwich ardent Zionist beliefs have been a source of alarm to the Arabs. Increasingly, an embarrassment to British administrators as well. Bentwich's role in drafting land legislation, I do want to talk about that too, because there was a really interesting, sort of change in the land management. We did talk about the sort of legal frameworks and their
Land
transformation
law.
during this time a little bit, and the Ottoman land law, but the way that the British managed it is interesting. There's another kind of article that gets into this a little bit that I definitely like to read from later on. But anyway, so Bentwich's role in drafting land legislation, procedures for political prisoners, and execution of collective punishments continued nonetheless. After the expropriation of land ordinance was decreed by Bentwich's office in 1924, and the Karmel Sheikh property near the holy places was subsequently taken by the government, Muslim council members expected the Zionists to seek expropriation of the wall pavement and the Abu Maidan property, and to cite as precedent the Karmel Sheikh case. Until the fall of 1928, with Jabotinsky in exile, and the Zionists, or quote unquote in exile, not really, but away, and the Zionist leadership preoccupied by economic adversities, the blocking strategy of the Supreme Muslim Council had been relatively effective, just as the same strategy used by the Arab executive to obstruct British-sponsored legislative councils had denied legitimacy to the mandate. But beginning in September 1928, new Zionist initiatives appeared. And in the altered structural circumstances created by Jabotinsky's apparent split from the Zionist leadership, a more sophisticated two-track strategy unfolded. Incremental gains could be won by the Zionist organization against the background of open agitation by the revisionist militants now actively reconstituted in Palestine. So by 1928, Jabotinsky created a sizable and politically disciplined revisionist following in Europe and had expanded the training of his uniformed Brit Trumpeldor, Beitar, right? The
Beitar units.
Yeah, which were sent to Palestine for military and pioneer service. Committing the mass membership of these movements to certain emotionally appealing issues in which success was equated with the survival of the Jewish community itself, again, ain't not new, Jabotinsky hoped to demonstrate the potency of uncompromising Jewish nationalism. No topic was more appropriate to these purposes than the rights of the wall. This issue gave him an opportunity to mobilize new support among the increasingly restless youths of Eastern Europe who were at once bored by the subtleties of synthetic Zionism and unmoved by Jewish communist advocacy of social revolution. So you can think of them as being the hecking Kurds of their day, the perfect cause to take up for disaffected youth.
Yeah, he was very active recruiting in interwar Poland, I think, during this period. That's where like a huge number of the pioneer immigrants were coming from, like in the 1920s. And from Eastern Europe in general. He was kicking up a storm.
Yeah, and talk about Occupy. Yeah, this was a different kind of Occupy movement that the youth were getting involved in.
Yeah.
Anticipating Yom Kippur observances for 1928, the militant Hebrew press in Jerusalem renewed the Zionists' earlier demands for a revision of the status quo at the Western Wall. The journalists opened their campaign by arguing that since the area in front of the wall was too small to allow Jews to worship in a large group, the Jewish National Fund should enlarge the space by purchasing the adjacent property and tearing down the Muslim houses which were located there. For the Yom Kippur service itself, Jewish officials decided to introduce additional religious vessels. More conspicuously, a large screen was attached to the pavement to separate male and female worshippers, as was the custom in synagogues. But plans for the service were prematurely exposed when, as a result of the jealousy between two minor Jewish functionaries, word of the innovations was leaked to Muslim and Palestine government officials. Mutawalli of the Abu Madian Waqf immediately complained to Keith Roach, the British Deputy District Commissioner of Jerusalem, who himself investigated the wall area on the eve of the service. He ruled that the items were indeed infringements of the status quo that Britain had pledged to uphold in the area, and he instructed the Jewish beadle to remove them before the following morning. When he learned on the following day that notwithstanding his order, the screen was still in use, Keith Roach decided to dispatch a policeman who would ensure its removal. No Jewish policemen were available for the task since they had been excused from duty on the holy day by request of the chief rabbis. Instead, a British police officer was sent. When he failed to persuade the Jewish worshippers to remove the screen, he undertook the job himself with the help of additional police officers. That the British officers had forcefully subdued some of the Jews who obstructed them led the Palestine Zionist executive to issue formal protests immediately after the Yom Kippur incident. After a meeting between Zionist leaders and British officials, including Bentwich, Zionist executive president Frederick Kish noted in his diary that the responsible authorities had treated a part of the religious furniture of the Wailing Wall as if it were a kiosk in a municipal garden. Arguing later that the Zionist executive's own staff should have been called upon to deal with the problem on Yom Kippur, Zionist publications began to demand the Deputy District Commissioner Keith Roach be fired and the police officers be disciplined. During the next month, the Zionist organization, along with Jabotinsky's staff at Dor Hayom, conducted a vigorous press campaign interpreting the Yom Kippur incidents as a deliberate violation of Jewish religious observance and an offense to Jewish humanity. In a letter to the Near East and India, Israel Cohen argued that since the screen had been used for 10 days earlier without Muslim objection, a precedent had been set for its continued use. Cohen went on to ask, if Jews could not be guaranteed unrestricted rights of public worship in their own national home, of what value is the Palestine Mandate?
Mm-hmm.
A major,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, it goes
that's
to show
tough.
like how they perceive what they perceive the purpose of the Palestine Mandate to be. But I guess it was kind of explicit what his purpose was.
Yeah.
The major Zionist protagonists on the wall issue, however, were those promoting Jabotinsky's vision of the Jewish nationalist program. Revisionist leaders had long appreciated the persuasiveness of mass demonstrations and had urged the Arab masses to be denied the type of education that would encourage them to organize the same political activities. Interesting. They
Hmm.
had also sensed that Britain's renewal in 1928 of discussions about a legislative council constituted, in Jabotinsky's words, a menace to Zionism because a new interest of several Arab leaders in such a prospect would give them common ground with their exalted British prompters. Seeing the wall as a test of Britain's willingness to satisfy other Zionist demands, the revisionist leaders embarked on a campaign mobilizing their own followers to demand outright transfer of the wall, even while risking the retaliation that such a campaign would provoke among the Arab masses.
Hmm.
So, of the two more probable outcomes that would result from the dramatization of the wall dispute, either outcome would enhance Zionist political goals. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's yeah. I was talking to my friend about this again, related to recent events, and like that's a common maneuver. Like, yeah, like he brought up the metaphor of like chess. He didn't bring up this particular thing, but there's a thing in chess. It's called like Zugzwang. I think it's like I think it's a German term. I don't know.
Oh, I think I've
Uh,
heard of it before. Yeah, what is that?
it's like when, because in chess you can't just be like I skip my move, you have to move
Right.
a piece every turn,
Yeah.
right? So your opponent can get you into a position where any move you make is going to hurt your position,
Uh-huh.
right? And that's like exactly, the position that like, colonized people, this is the position that like the Arab majorities in a lot of these countries have found themselves in,
Totally.
both now and in the
Totally.
past. A bloodless Zionist victory on the wall issue would bring to the Zionist movement greater support, especially from those needing visible symbols of the Jewish Renaissance in Jerusalem. And even if tensions over the wall were ultimately to trigger anti-Jewish attacks, the Yishuv would have intensified sympathy from the outside world, while the Arabs would be faulted and then divided by recriminations among themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Another
Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
sentence.
Parallels to today.
In either process, Jabotinsky's vigilante, with the vital financial support of several wealthy English and American Zionists, would contribute to the dynamic element for Zionist bargaining.
Mm-hmm.
During October 1928, the columns in Dor Hayom and the agenda of revisionist meetings were seized with the wall question. Jabotinsky and his followers now argued the wall was of dubious significance to the Muslims, who should therefore not be allowed to impede Jewish ownership by historically based legal arguments. Several of the activists passed on rumors that the Muslim officials now plan to suppress even individual Jewish prayers by building a mosque or a minaret on the wall and constructing a gate that would bar Jews from visiting the wall. False rumors
Mm-hmm.
spreading.
Yeah.
Then at the yeah,
Disinformatia. Yeah.
yeah, disinformatia, yeah, literally, yeah, I guess in Jabotinsky's case.
Yeah.
Then at a meeting of the Vad Leomi on October 17th, Menachem Ushishkin demanded that a bold action be taken to stop all Muslim repair operations in the wall area. Within a few days, thousands of supporters in London and Paris attracted publicity through protest fasts. At the wall itself, exchanges of insults between Arabs and Jews sparked at least one violent clash that, in the ensuing legal skirmishes, heightened resentment in both communities.
Mm.
Just as the Muslims had predicted, Vad Leomi representative Jacob Thon now officially urged the Palestine government to treat the Karmel Sheikh expropriation as a precedent for taking the Abu Madyan property, which, Thon argued, contained only the hovels of the poor and thereby lacked sacred significance to Muslims. Just a hellhole. It's just full
Yeah.
of, yeah, just
It's
a
a
hellhole full of
shithole.
Muslims. You can take it.
Yeah.
Yeah. The VAD, as well as the Zionist Executive, petitions the Permanent Mandates Commission to approve such an expropriation. From various locales in the diaspora, top Zionist officials began to warn the British Colonial Office about the difficulties they faced in controlling the situation. In Geneva on October 30th, Victor Jacobson, the Zionist organization's chief lobbyist at the League of Nations, worried aloud to Eric Drummond that unless the problem were resolved, moderate Jews would probably be unable to control Jabotinsky's armed and now highly agitated ex-soldiers. On the following day, a letter arrived at the Colonial Office from Weizmann, who was in New York, enlisting support for the Jewish agency that Britain had endorsed as a means of broadening Jewish participation in Zionist colonizing projects. Weizmann complained that his work in America was being hindered by Jewish dissatisfaction over the Palestine government's handling of the wall dispute. Reiterating Jacobson's message, Weizmann went on to mention the provocative rumor about the Arabs building or proposing to build a mosque on the Wailing Wall, the mere suggestion of which the Zionists considered a desecration of the only holy place to which the Jews can lay claim. Altogether, according to Weizmann, the issue was growing into an affair of the first magnitude. Weizmann's own remarks the next day to 700 New York Zionists gathered at the Hotel Astor repeatedly denounced Arab agitators for disturbing relations between Jews and Arabs over the wall issue and for fomenting anti-Jewish attacks. After his speech, a resolution was unanimously adopted to reproach British officials for interfering at the wall during Yom Kippur. Zionist official strategy next proceeded on two levels, which each rendered more effective because of the stridency of Jabotinsky's group, without abandoning hope of the significant political victory that outright acquisition of the wall would entail, especially for Jewish agency fundraising among the devout Orthodox and non-Zionist sectors of the Jewish community. Zionist leaders nonetheless valued the incremental gains that could be made by striking a conciliatory posture in public while privately taking every opportunity to revise their legal status at the wall. In London, Chief Rabbi Hertz advised Colonial Secretary Leopold Amory that expropriation was no longer what the Jews were demanding. They would rather reach agreement on friendly exchange of waqf almhouses at a price wholly incommensurate with the value of these dilapidated hovels. This is, pretty infuriating. At the same time, Zionist Executive Secretary Leonard Stein assured the British government that the Zionist executive raised no question about the ownership of the wall itself. From the Zionist executive in Jerusalem, Kish acceded to the Palestine government's request, which he had refused 1 month earlier, to soften the tone of Zionist pronouncements on the wall question. He issued a carefully restricted statement recognizing the inviolability of the Muslim holy places, that phrasing being consistent with the Zionist argument that the Abu Madyan property had no sacred significance. The Vad Leumi at the same time wrote a letter to the Arab nation assuring that no Jew has ever thought of encroaching upon the Muslims' rights to their own holy places. Their own in italics, but italics added. From an anonymous Zionist source in Palestine, a proposal to take the property near the wall from the Muslims in exchange for land elsewhere was forwarded to the Colonial Office through London friends. The strategy of trading something, like getting concessions in exchange for giving things that like you've stolen is I guess age old here. But pressures to take outright position on the wall were maintained by militant Zionists who viewed themselves as the last defenders of Jewish rights. Jabotinsky and his followers continued to build their newspaper circulation by publicizing what were said to be Muslim slurs against Jewish national pride. This campaign went forward against the pleas of Jewish intellectuals from both liberal and communist factions. In a dramatic appeal to Jabotinsky to let the issue recede, the writer Ben Avi warned, "You prepare the way for killing Jews. You will be responsible for Jews' deaths, and you will be judged." In the Arab community, the Yom Kippur incident focused new attention on the Supreme Muslim Council as the body responsible not only for Muslim religious affairs, but for defending the political rights that were implicitly at stake in the wall question. Like the Zionists, the Muslims' immediate response was to organize public worshippers into protest activities. A week after the Yom Kippur incident, hundreds of Muslims who had gathered for prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque were encouraged to sign petitions alerting the government that Jewish leaders were attempting by equivocation to claim possession of the Western Wall. The petitions asked the government to remove from the pavement every article used by the Jews. In the more deliberative atmosphere of the following week, Supreme Muslim Council President Amin al-Husseini explained in a letter to the High Commissioner that the religious significance which Muslims attach to the Barak enclosure and the wall, al-Husseini accordingly asked the government to reject the Zionist demand that only Jewish officers be allowed to police the area. On October 8th, al-Husseini wrote another memorandum to reaffirm the Muslims' special reverence for the Barak and Al-Aqsa Mosque. In this letter, al-Husseini cited previous attempts by Jewish leaders to expand their rights. He then requested an official British statement to spell out the rights of the two religious communities according to long-accepted practice. What was interpreted as the Muslim officials' tactical response to the Yom Kippur incident came a week later. Arguing that they must be able to observe Jewish activities at the Western Wall more closely, and thereby prevent undesirable precedents from being established without their knowledge, Supreme Muslim Council officials proceeded with the first phase of their long-planned remodeling program. By renovating his quarters in the Sharia court and by lowering the wall on the outside balcony, al-Husseini would have made a clear view of the pavement below. A new gateway giving neighboring Muslims direct access to the Haram was to be built as well. Some of the traditionalist sheikhs and a few political militants, however, drew attention to the long-term pattern of Jewish activities at the wall and saw in that pattern an insidious and expansionary design which threatened Muslim rights at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which shares the same wall as it becomes the south side of the Haram, as well as the Barak enclosure inside the wall. But it was specifically the possibility of Zionist success in promoting the British expropriation of the Waqf property adjacent to the wall that these religious notables stressed. A special committee to defend the noble Barak was formed to block Jewish acquisition. In its declaration of October 25th, the committee emphasized its view that the strategy by which Jewish militants had provoked incidents at the wall. The committee stood by one of the Mughrabi residents who, they reported, was a target of abusive remarks as he passed near the wall and was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for assaulting those who had insulted him. Later, the committee prepared a pamphlet quoting the speeches and publications of Zionist leaders such as Lord Melchet, Norman Bentwich, Israel Zangwill, who's also come up, whose use of ancient Hebrew terms for the Haram area and whose references to future possession of the temple enclosure seemed, to the Muslims, to connote political designs. I mean, fair enough. Yeah. Although the wall issue had created new pressures among Muslim Arabs for a more militant posture on all political questions, the strategy pursued by the Supreme Muslim Council was largely one of minimizing losses rather than maximizing gains. Wow, the residences. Yeah. The Zionist leaders, in stating their desire to change the status quo at the holy places, enjoyed official credibility, not only because of their political influence in London or their financial partnership with Britain and Palestine, but also because colonial office bureaucrats, despite growing misgivings, felt British honor had been committed in the Balfour obligation. The Arab leaders found themselves in the reverse bargaining position to remain in official capacity under the Palestine government and to maintain that the Arab community was orderly enough to warrant self-government. Arab officials had to pursue a cautious and highly defensive strategy on any of the political issues that confronted them. In these circumstances, the militant, mass-oriented splinter, which was so helpful to the Zionist cause, could only bring defeat to the Arab, including Muslim officials. And so, in the late 1920s, Muslim leader Amin al-Husseini had to rely upon British legal recognition of Muslim property rights around the wall. Late in October 1928, al-Husseini met with the acting high commissioner to convey the Supreme Muslim Council's guarantee that traditional Jewish observances at the wall could continue without disturbance. After reviewing the Zionists' earlier allusions to the temple area and their more recent demands for government expropriation of the Abu Madian Waqf, al-Husseini noted that certain Muslim groups were now asking him to build a mosque on the pavement, thereby preempting any Jewish construction plans. Assured by Luke that the Palestine government would not allow the Abu Madian Waqf to be expropriated, al-Husseini agreed to calm the Arab press and moderate resolutions on the wall issue at the coming Muslim General Assembly. On November 1st, Jerusalem was the site of the assembly that drew Muslims from all over the Fertile Crescent and Egypt. Certain speakers at the conference blamed the holy places controversy on British imperial policy and forewarned of a Muslim rising against any European powers attempting to encroach on the Haram al-Sharif. Although many explicitly anti-British statements were heard during the general discussion, the resolutions that were actually passed under al-Husseini's stewardship referred more moderately to the growing agitation of Muslims and the Assembly's determination to hold the government responsible for maintaining order at the holy places. Following the conference, the Supreme Muslim Council continued with its planned remodeling program. Later in November, additional symbols of Muslim control were reinstituted. One house of the Abu Madian Foundation was converted into a zawiyah, a religious hospice or Sufi hospice, and the muezzin was authorized to renew traditional prayer calls. Yeah, so that was very provocative to them, as we'll see. Within a few weeks, a British white paper appeared, its phrasing directly reflecting that of Stein's parliamentary question. The white paper defended the Palestine government's action on Yom Kippur as a faithful discharge of the status quo policy required by the Mandate Article 13. Further statements expressed the government's hope the Jewish and Muslim officials could agree upon a protocol regulating the conduct of the services at the wall without prejudice to the legal rights. Without prejudice to the legal rights of the Muslim owners, and in such a way as to satisfy normal liturgical requirements and decencies in matters of public worship. To the Muslims, the terms of the white paper denoted activities considerably beyond those that had been allowed by religious authorities in past centuries. Nonetheless, al-Husseini declared to Deputy District Commissioner Keith Roach that he would be satisfied with the government's policy if it would strictly uphold ownership rights as established prior to the mandate. The Mufti commended the government for the care and insight and justice without partiality, which has clearly and plainly dispelled any doubts under which widespread and false propaganda has attempted to conceal and hide the status quo. Thus, by December of 1928, the Muslim position in the Western Wall controversy depended on British officials to maintain the status quo, despite the latter's predisposition toward a negotiated modus vivendi in which Zionist rights would be enlarged. And the Muslim leadership, in traditional fashion, dealt with the issue in religious and legal terms rather than reaching the more clearly political questions which were entailed in the rights of the Mughrabi residents, whose homes and centuries-old family ties to that part of Jerusalem would be lost if they were forced to evacuate as Zionist proposals implied. At the same time, leaders of the Zionist organization had several types of factional pressures to add into their bargaining equation. At times, they treated the aggressive demands of Jabotinsky's group as legitimate pressures to which their own lobbying efforts must respond. At other times, they could deny any intent to infringe on Muslim rights by advancing the minimally political views of the liberal intellectuals, i.e., that individual Jews choosing to exercise their rights of access should be allowed to do so without annoyance. Alternating between these two postures, the Zionist executive continued to explore entrepreneurial and legal devices by which the Yishuv could acquire new property rights of the holy places. All right, yeah, so this part is interesting here. And not, again, you can see the resonances. During the first half of 1929, as competition on the wall issue intensified, the Zionists again took the offensive by trying to curtail the Muslims' right to repair their own facilities near the wall. Simultaneously, Zionist leaders sought to eliminate the restraints on Jewish group worship at the wall that Muslim officials had upheld over the centuries. By citing harassment and requesting Britain's good offices for a negotiated settlement, the Zionist leaders still hoped to acquire the Abu Median Waqf. In response to these initiatives, Muslim leaders in the following months relied on the status quo pledge of the White Paper and accordingly justified the Muslim position on the basis of historical practice. When the government requested that all renovation activities at the wall be suspended until the relative legal rights of the two communities could be examined by British law officers, al-Husseini acceded to the request. Subsequently, he pledged to abide by whatever findings the law officers would report. It's just so tragic because, like, yeah, they're just like, well, what about this agreement? I mean, you could compare it to a million different situations. You can compare it to what we see with the Golan Heights today, where they're like, well, what about 1974? Like, or, come on, this is like our sovereign territory. Like, they're invading. Like, that's not okay. Like, every single country, every single Arab country, plenty of other countries, basically everyone with the US and Israel, like, condemning this. But still, it's like, well, like, they gotta defend themselves. And, like, but you could also compare it to what we saw, in the United States with the Native Americans, really.
Of course,
like
you have
all
plenty
these
of nice liberal politicians talking about treaties and things like that. But then you had like the raw power of both settlers and the U.S. Army sort of imposing that reality. And yeah, it really comes out. The author, I think this is what they call wall politics, where there's like this kind of like 1-2 punch of, on the one hand, like with one hand, you are kind of using this sort of like liberal intellectual argument and kind of adopting a moderate stance, and but also coming up with like clever little loopholes to kind of quietly kind of get what you want. And then with the other hand, you're like smashing people and like punching, and the nice wing can get, the good cop can kind of pretend that they're very different from the bad cop, but like they're working in tandem. And Jabotinsky is kind of you can see sort of the ethos of like his activities and his gangs in what would become like the IDF and the Mossad. In some cases, like those militias they literally like were part of the constituent forces of the IDF, right?
Exactly. Yeah. The good cop, bad cop thing, like, is something that really, like, I feel like they honed that strategy with the British Mandate, and now like it's in use with the United States. I mean, there's layers of good cop, bad cop in a way, because you have like the kind of like liberal Zionists and you have Jabotinsky. So there's like there's a good cop, bad cop element there, but there's also like with the mandate itself. And now, Israel's like the bad cop and the US is like the good cop. But they're both cops. They're both trying to get you,
but you can
and
see
then
kind
try
of
you for revolting and execute you,
right.
Even though
it is interesting how I do feel like the U.S. has increasingly like taken on really the good cop position, whereas we used to try to at least pretend to be a little bit more of like a mediator, between parties. But because I feel like there is no like faction in Israel anymore that is even kind of like performing the good cop function so much, in terms of like maybe talking about a two-state solution one day, or like we can all live in peace or something like that. You know what I mean?
Israelis are so like just far gone that like they do perceive that probably, but like to any reasonable person, it's imperceptible. Like they still think that they have like a left wing, I think.
Yeah.
Like that, like, probably have talked about this in the show sometimes. Like sometimes when you see like Israelis arguing amongst themselves, and like some guy will be saying like the most bloodthirsty thing in the world, and you'd be like, wow, this guy is evil. Like I can't believe like how genocidal he's being. And then like another Israeli will come in and be like, you liberal, like you're trying, like you're gonna get us all killed, like you hate Jews, and it's like, what the hell? Like,
That's interesting.
so
yeah. Echoes Ukraine a little bit.
Difficult to perceive like from the outside, but like to them, they like do think that like they have like, a good cop element probably. But yeah, no.
You can see it in the US as well, the way people
yeah.
think that like Democrats are communists or something when
Yeah,
they're
true,
pretty
yeah.
much like pretty dedicated to upholding the empire. And,
Yeah.
sometimes the way in which they do it is mistaken for, but you sort of need that duality. It's much more tactically effective when it's not all Jabotinsky. I think that's what we're seeing now is like the Jabotinskyization of like mainstream Israeli culture, like or the total domination of it as like a normal way of being. When this guy, he was somewhat on the one hand controversial at this time, but also you could see the more moderate Zionists like learn to kind of use him and his crazy antics like selectively, even though sometimes he talks shit about them and kind of said, kind of fronts like, they're fake Zionists and like, but really, I mean, he's a turbo Zionist. Like he doesn't think anybody else is Zionist enough. And, of course sometimes you need that ultra wing to like, stir, to like propel the main party forward.
Exactly. Yeah.
In a deniable way, a little bit.
Yeah. So the Zionists fruitfully searched for documentary evidence of Jewish rights at the wall. They weren't able to find anything. There's a funny footnote. She writes, it is interesting to note Ben Vinisti's account of these maneuvers. In the second half of the 1920s, the Muslims began to claim that it was not only forbidden to place benches and barriers in the alleyway, but to even bring Torah scrolls to the wall or to hold prayers in public. They demanded that the mandatory government judge the issue. When the government delayed its decision, the Mufti began a series of provocations. So yeah, that's like kind of the alternate historiography, but
that's what they say.
Yeah, exactly.
The Mufti started this. So far,
the Mufti started everything.
This does feel more like tactically instigated from the Zionist side, and also like getting even psyoping their own people to think that the Muslims were up to something, to get them all whipped up in the first place. Where some authors were like, "Hey, don't focus on this. This is bad. This is gonna spiral out of control." But Jabotinsky,
in a big way, that's like how this was kind of interpreted. Like, there's an interesting article about communal violence that might be good to read next. But anyway, so the report that was finally forwarded to Jerusalem restricted Muslim activities to those which would not interfere with Jewish worshippers during customary times of prayer. Thus limited, Muslim refurbishing activities were allowed to resume. Muslim officials were not informed of the report's recommendation to grant jurisdiction on the wall dispute to the Palestine courts administered by Attorney General Bentwich. In early August 1929, Muslim reconstruction activities drew verbal fire from Zionist representatives attending the 16th Zionist Congress at Zurich. At the same time, in Jerusalem, the temporary members of the Palestine Zionist executive joined the chief rabbis in publicly demanding possession of the wall. Even the more moderate Hebrew press in Jerusalem uttered anew the symbolic references to the rebuilding the ancient temple, quote unquote symbolic.
Yeah,
by mid-August,
thousands.
Exactly. The hologram. By mid-August, thousands of Jabotinsky's followers in the Betar and Maccabee organizations vowed to shed blood if necessary to regain the wall. These groups assembled for a demonstration at the wall on the holy day of Tisha B'Av. This is where it all kind of kicks off. When they raised the Zionist flag at the wall while singing the Zionist national anthem and proclaiming the wall to be solely Jewish, they were unmistakably courting Arab retaliation. During the next week, Jabotinsky's quote-unquote defense squads and Arab workers clashed in violent incidents too numerous to be recounted here. And so on August 23rd erupted a week of rioting in which hundreds of people were killed and hundreds more injured in both communities. Trying to maintain control over Muslim activists without capitulating to Zionist pressures, al-Husseini was trapped into a legalist position in which his best hope was to minimize the erosion of Muslim rights in the wall area. This no-win position, there you go, that's the Zug slang.
Lose-lose,
Yeah. resulted partly from his failure to include in the Muslim strategy the broader set of issues, including Arab rights to property and protection of livelihood, which the wall dispute reflected. That these broader socioeconomic rather than strictly religious aspects were a major cause of the August 1929 violence was evident not only in investigatory reports but in the nature of each violent incident leading up to the rioting of August 23rd. Refusing to encourage mass rebellion, al-Husseini instead affirmed his trust in the government, but his reassurances had only temporarily calmed the fearful Muslim crowds, who gathered on August 23rd for Friday prayers and eventually succumbed to the pleading of the self-appointed Arab demagogues and the provocations by the revisionist squads stationed at scattered points in and near Jerusalem's old city. And, although British intelligence reports on the Mufti's activities confirmed his repeated efforts to maintain public order, he was ultimately forced to defend himself against formal charges from the Zionist executive that he had incited anti-Jewish attacks. Documentary evidence for these charges consisted mainly of an anonymous letter, which was shown later to have been forged by a quote-unquote non-Arab writer.
All right.
And there you go.
Yep.
As
Yeah.
soon as,
No,
yeah.
he does. David Simon refuted. Wow.
Yeah.
No
yeah.
evidence. Yeah.
As soon as they learned the violence that had engulfed Palestine, Zionist leaders in London renewed their demands that the wall be expropriated. In Jerusalem, responding to the deeply shaken Jewish communities, the Palestine government issued instructions which implicitly interpreted the status quo at the wall. Certain portable appurtenances explicitly associated with worship, i.e., Jewish public prayer rather than individual visits and devotions, were to be allowed at all times. Additional items were to be permitted for Sabbath, Sabbath Eve, and Holy Day services. Although screens and benches were explicitly prohibited, the restriction of public access to the wall area during worship hours established the area as indisputably a Jewish sanctuary at those times. When Muslim and Christian Arab leaders repeatedly and angrily protested such changes, they were told the instructions were only temporary, intended merely to maintain order at the holy places, pending final determination of rights. Sound familiar? By an ad hoc commission authorized into the Council of the League of Nations. 18 months later, the fact that order had been maintained at the wall led British officials to credit the instructions as the source of success. It was largely on such a recommendation that the ad hoc commission then established the quote-unquote temporary provisions as the basis for regulating activity at the wall throughout the future years of the mandate. Almost immediately after the quote-unquote temporary regulations were issued in early October 1929, Jewish officials introduced into their ceremony at the wall the long prohibited practice of blowing the shofar. Muslim officials vehemently objected to this innovation, which they argued was intended to equate religious observances at the wall with those normally conducted in synagogues. Although the Zionist incremental gains would prove significant in this in future, they were nonetheless deprecated by Zionist leaders while new claims were justified. Shortly after Jewish worship rights at the wall were confirmed, the temporary regulations, quote unquote temporary, Chief Rabbis Kook and Meir wrote to Chancellor, we deem it our duty to express to Your Excellency our strong protest and deep indignation at this violation of religious sentiments and to declare most insistently that we do not accept this order or all other orders and new arrangements in connection with services at the wall as a normal state of affairs, and that we shall by no means henceforth agree to it. The chief rabbis wrote again a week later to condemn the government's decision prohibiting the use of the shofar at the wall. Such an insult to our religious sentiments and traditions, such as an interference in our own internal religious affairs, can only be equaled by the persecutions of Jews in the Dark Ages. Okay.
Wow. Okay.
Our enemies, like banning blowing on one horn, can only be compared to the persecutions of Jews in the Dark Ages. Our enemies, while you're literally in the process of like displacing people from their homes so you can set up your own whatever. Our enemies who have been brought upon us by the bloody confusion of the last few weeks, which have stirred the people of Israel and the civilized world as a whole, are apparently ready to continue their acts of terror and are bringing pressure to bear upon the government to help them and comply with their wishes. The feeling that we have nobody to rely upon save our Heavenly Father, the desire to prevent any further disturbances and collisions in the country at all costs, move us this time to accept this insulting order. The chief rabbinate of the Palestine Jews, the Jewish Yeshuv, and the people of Israel as a whole will never reconcile themselves to this assault on their religious sentiments and traditions. Yeah, and this last section is strategy assessments then and now.
Right.
Beginning in the autumn of 1929 with the shofar incident and culminating 16 months later in their outrage at the MacDonald letter, which is, a letter read out loud in the House of Commons by Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald to Chaim Weizmann in response to Zionist pressure, which reversed the official policy expressed in the Passfield White Paper in 1930, announcing the British government's intention to suspend Jewish immigration to and land purchases in Palestine. So this is kind of the issue of like, was this always determined? There were some opportunities to go their way. But anyway, a year later, they reversed it and they recognized the legitimacy of Arab fears about the Zionist project. Oh, sorry, the passive white paper did that, but McDonald reversed, British support for that white paper completely.
Yeah.
So beginning in the autumn of 1929 with the Shofar incident and culminating 6 months later in the outrage of the McDonald letter, Muslim and Arab leaders were obliged to reassess their strategy not only on the wall question, but on the more vital matter of political representation in Palestine. By the time of his interview with the High Commissioner Chancellor on October 8th, 1929, Haj Amin al-Husseini was admitting the failure of the Muslims' legalistic tactics and defensive strategy. According to Chancellor's notes in that meeting, al-Husseini had drawn the following bitter conclusions from the Western Wall experience. The Muslims were losing their rights because they had only asked for what was bare justice. The Jews were asking for 5 times more than what they could hope to receive, and they, the Muslims, now saw that if they had followed the same tactics, it would have been much better. They were suffering by reason of the tolerance they had displayed in the past.
Interesting.
This is when, he was starting to get blackpilled. This is, the kind of stuff that was sending him on the dark path that led him in some, unconscionable directions, as we talked about last time.
Yes.
On the Western Wall issue, as on the supposedly resolved matter of Jewish colonization in Transjordan, the Zionist executive continued to claim for the yeshiva a full range of preferences. Sorry, full range. I don't know why I failed to make the vowel U. The full range of privileges that were demanded for it by Jabotinsky's faction. But by adopting the more accommodating language associated with groups like Brit Shalom, and upon occasion denouncing the chauvinism and vigilante methods of Jabotinsky's group, Zionist organization leaders were able to advance significantly toward their political objectives. The Western Wall issue illustrates the dynamics not only of the Arab-Zionist confrontation as it emerged earlier in the century, but also of the learning process which occurs in any conflict as opposing sides devise and test their strategies. On a wide range of issues connected with their overall political problem, Palestinians indicate today that they have learned from past failures of strategy. On the question of rights in the Old City, Arab residents of Jerusalem convey a political consciousness of far stronger and more comprehensive than was evident 50 years ago, although overall strategy has remained essentially defensive, especially under the difficulties which military occupation entails. There are new emphases which contrast markedly with the Palestinian strategy reviewed in this article. In conjunction with the Arab thought form, for example, Ibrahim Dakak's report views the treatment of Arab rights in Jerusalem as a test of the ability to reach a total settlement for the Palestine question. Arab rights to control their holy places are treated as an inextricable part of the political question. The rights of Arab residents to housing and social services are emphasized in an economic and social program which parallels political demands. And rather than religious or municipal bodies, it is a centralized structure of the PLO, recognized as the sole legitimate representative of all the Palestinian people, demanding self-determination and the return of all refugees to their land, which is cited as the appropriate bargaining agent for Jerusalem's Arab residents. I'll finish reading this, but it's interesting to note, think about what became of the PLO.
Right.
The
this
PLO
is written in the late 70s.
Exactly.
So interesting.
The PLO may itself have learned several instructional lessons which are illustrated by Zionist strategy and success in quote-unquote wall politics. Namely, that the factional differences which are decried as evidence of disunity in a defensive strategy may, as was the case with the Zionists, be coordinated in conjunction with an offensive strategy to enhance bargaining opportunities. As the success of the latter, in turn, depends on a favorable alignment with support in the international control system, is also exemplified in the wall dispute. Already enjoying the role of partner in Britain's imperial policy, Zionist strategy was well calculated to feed the hopes of British administrators who, though obligated by British domestic politics and imperial interests to uphold the Balfour policy, nonetheless tried to convince themselves that they were quote-unquote balancing Arab rights and Zionist demands. The agility of the Zionist leaders in dealing with such administrators was attested in mid-October of 1929 after a full year of the Zionists' two-track pressures to obtain the wall. High Commissioner Chancellor indignantly noted in his file, "I had a telegram from the Muslim Christian Association of Jaffa in which it is stated that the Barak is the sole property of the Muslims. Of course it is. Everybody except some of the extremist Zionist Jews recognize that it is so." Ellipsis.
Ellipsis. Damn.
Yeah.
Ellipsis.
So yes, that's how that went down.
Yeah. So you can see, I don't know, the weaponization of basically weaponizing a religious issue that has huge political implications, right? And kind of establishes a precedent for taking over more shit.
Yeah, the religious versus like political element is interesting to read, like in conversation. I won't read this whole article, like I basically read that entire article, but this one for Alex Winder, it's worth shouting out. It's the Western Wall riots of 1929, religious boundaries and communal violence. This is very sort of this article has less of a point of view than the other one, and it's more about like kind of intervening in like a debate over like how to frame the discussion of this. But it does have an interesting point, which kind of dovetails with what the point of the other article was vis-a-vis the religious framing and things like that. He says, strikingly, Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safad were home to 3 of Palestine's oldest Jewish communities. Their Jewish inhabitants, having lived for generations as a recognized component of Palestinian Arab society. These cities were also among Palestine's 4 Jewish holy cities, the 4th being Tiberias, and as such, religious Jews who populated them were largely, though not completely, disconnected from the growing Zionist presence in Palestine. Most explanations of the 1929 riots follow one of 2 paradigms. The first sees them as the expression of Muslim fanaticism and Arab anti-Semitism, a particular instance of a continuous and constant ethno-religious conflict which, though at times held in check by political power, was constantly in danger of breaking out into open violence. The second places them in the context of the developing political conflict in Palestine, focusing either on the role of the British administration in its failure to anticipate or stave off the violence, or on the role of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, who during this period emerged as the preeminent political leader of the Palestinians. Each approach has flaws. The first assumes that certain innate religious identities with essential characteristics, particularly Jewish vulnerability and Muslim violence, and conflates the 1929 rioting in Palestine with violence against Jews in medieval and modern Europe and elsewhere in the Arab world. We can see the connection between like exactly the way it was framed at the time and the way that it's framed in the historiography now. At the same time, this paradigm tends to minimize specific context of the event, thus offering a limited understanding of the causes without fully explaining why violence occurs at certain times but not at others. The second approach overemphasizes the role of immediate political events in the violence and ignores deeper social structures. Although it offers far greater insight than the first, explanation of the 1929 violence solely as a product of recent political developments is also limiting. This article approaches the communal violence of 1929 from a different angle. Instead of searching for essential core characteristics by which particular communities defend themselves, it sees communities as most often defined by their boundaries, the points at which they come up against other communities. From this perspective, communal violence can be viewed as an attempt to reinforce, redefine, or reestablish boundaries marked in geographical space, including by signifiers such as clothing and language and other practices. So this has an interesting angle, which is basically, well, it might be good to just read what they say. More broadly, the article seeks to rescue the events of 1929 from essentialist or exclusively political interpretations, and in so doing, to restore the notions of restore to the notions of religious and nationalist the complexity that is their due. Neither religion nor nationalism exists as a unified, homogeneous, or static system. Rather, each emerges and changes in keeping with the practices and discourses of those who claim them. To think of the 1929 riots in terms of Muslims attacking Jews or Palestinians resisting Zionists tells us little either of how the violence was intended or how it was interpreted by its perpetrators and its victims, all of whom saw themselves and the quote-unquote other in more complicated terms shaped by experiences and expectations developed over years and even generations. These experiences and expectations, based on a lived daily life far removed from the realm of high politics, include notions of community and its boundaries, and are major factors in how individuals on all sides interpreted the events.
Fair enough.
Yeah, he made an interesting point later on. Basically, the idea being that these sort of community boundaries were heavily disturbed by the sort of change that had existed for a long time, kind of as he mentioned,
the agitations around
they
the
were kind of
around the wall.
Well, yeah, the provocations around the wall, not just those themselves, but the whole political situation of the British Mandate,
of course,
transformed the only word that's coming to my mind right now is status quo. Not necessarily in the sense that al-Husseini was trying to protect it, but not necessarily just a pure political status quo, but an older sort of status quo of sort of coexistence between these communities.
Right.
Not that it was entirely, idyllic or anything like that. It wasn't there was occasional violence, but nothing but it escalated in this way
essentially been
because of
a
the
centuries-long
disruption.
status quo. Yeah,
Yes.
that was disrupted by the. You're right. Just the whole context of the mandate. Okay.
This is what he says, which I think is pretty fair. Like he says, the goal of examining the religious dimensions of violence in August 1929 is certainly not a call to return to this kind of understanding. Rather, it is to try to unravel the layered meanings of violence in Jerusalem, Safed, and Hebron. In his study of religious minorities in medieval Europe, David Nierenberg, again, like not a scholar who I'm a big fan of, but I think here it's kind of interesting. It's worth reading. Violence was a central and systematic aspect of the coexistence of majority and minorities. And even he even suggests that coexistence was predicated on such violence. So again, that's like kind of I don't know, like I don't really love David Nierenberg as a scholar, like I said, for various reasons, but there's something like to that, like that there was violence at times, but generally like it existed within kind of some like basically a worked out balance, not to portray it as this like idyllic thing. But so he writes this approach positioned against a rose-tinted haven of tolerance and a darkening valley of tears can help make sense of the transitions and changes that were taking place in Palestine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The previous era of social coexistence has been predicated on restrictions on Jewish life, including their geographical segregation into Jewish quarters and restrictions on access to religious sites, including the Western Wall, Al Barak, and the tomb of the patriarchs Haram al-Ibrahimi. Violence was a ritualized element of coexistence. Regarding observers' unpreparedness for the scale of violence that broke out in 1929, Nicole notes the prevailing view. This violence, properly controlled and channeled, has always been circumscribed. Why then imagine the worst? Political, economic, and demographic shifts had all combined, however, to make the continuation of this coexistence impossible. Harath argues that this would have been conditional upon the indigenous Jewish residents identifying with Arab nationalism and being culturally Arab, at the least upon a continuation of the Jewish tradition of self-effacement as a tolerated religious community, millet taking no part in administrative and public life. It was not simply a matter of Jewish rejection of continued self-effacement, however. The breakdown of the old social order among the Muslim and Christian communities is also evident. In Hebron, for example, notable Muslim families sheltered many Jews, but they were unable to control the contours of violence. That many of the attackers were from villages outside Hebron also indicates the inversion of the traditional dominance of the urban over the rural. Usama Makdisi has illustrated how communal violence in the 19th century in Lebanon was shaped by imperial power and by local elites and non-elites, that is, Ottoman and European imperial power, for whom sectarianism could be mobilized to challenge the existing social order. Makdisi also argues that the Ottoman state and local elites reacted to establish dominance in a way that produced a discourse of sectarianism that masked a final restoration of an elitist social order in Mount Lebanon and marked the end of a genuinely popular, if always ambivalent, participation in politics. Regarding Palestine, I guess this is a quote from Makdisi, a paradigm of violence was constructed in common perception as well as among officials as religious, undoubtedly primitive, but because it is spontaneous and organized, easily controllable as long as the secular arm appears swiftly and firmly. Unaware or purposely ignoring everything of the often harmonious cohabitation between Jews and Muslims in Islamic lands, including in Ottoman Palestine, it was indeed common for many analysts to read interwar developments in light of an eternal conflict between them, thereby justifying colonial domination, presented as a peacemaker and not, needless to say, as a form of state violence. Mm-hmm. The British thus refused to acknowledge that the violence of 1929 both drew on existing paradigms of ritual violence map into religious boundaries and expressed the breakdown of these paradigms and their failure to maintain boundaries in the new social, political, and economic conditions of Palestine. Rather than address the factors that had led to this breakdown, British authorities saw the preservation of authority through the construction and enforcement of new boundaries that reflected Zionist imperatives. The full geographic segregation of Jews and non-Jews secured through British state violence. Thus, events of 1929 help us understand not only how British rule and Zionist encroachment threatened an older social order, but also how the ground was laid for partition. There you go.
Yeah. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess they destabilized everything about the society, so it makes sense that the stasis would not hold necessarily and erupt into
like you said, there was a centuries old sort of like status quo, which was like, again, not perfect but stable, and then it was destabilized, but then they chose to cast that in terms of like an eternal conflict between, just like you see now
it's
with
the old
Sunnis
trick. It's the old trick that they do.
They've been fighting each other for thousands of years.
They've they're doing it here. They did it in the Balkans. They did it. They kind of are even. I feel like even the Ukraine kind of Russia stuff. Like, you know,
Yeah, exactly. The eternal battle between Russia and Ukraine.
right. These
Um,
people are so different.
yeah,
And they can't live with each other. Kind of I don't know. Yeah, just the reversion to the kind of the ancient hatreds thesis of
yeah,
and then of course like the benevolent peacekeeper gets to come in as the impartial referee and just keep
yes,
these savage groups from eternally killing each other, which is just totally what they'd be doing if there's no imperialist or colonial power,
yeah.
involved. Yeah, no,
Next
it's a
time, I definitely want to read this article, which was great, which deals more with, the 1936 revolt, but it's called "The Banality of Brutality,"
oh
and it
yeah, I
really
don't.
like belies that whole thing, which I really think resonates a lot today. Like this idea that you know, and you see it there's many permutations of it, but this idea that oh, these people are just savage and they just need someone to it just goes in on how what exactly the British Mandate did when they were responding to this revolt and the insane depraved activities that they
Yeah, I mean,
undertook.
just
Um
off the top, like if you look up the Wikipedia article for the 1936 Arab Revolt, like the top picture on it is like these British guys they're riding one of those little like I don't know, one of those little train lorries or something,
yeah,
and they have two Arab Palestinian guys like tied up on a little platform like in the front. And it was like British officers using two Arab Palestinian men as human shields, like 1937. And it's like, okay. Oh, like literally, I mean,
yeah,
like obviously, like very visibly there, they had little human shield trolleys. I guess they would like travel around in with prisoners, like, Arab Palestinian prisoners tied up as human shields, which is
yes.
ironic given what gets said today
That's
about
insanely
Palestinians.
evil. Yes,
Yeah, yeah, and that's
exactly.
just
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
that's the top pick on what that's just the Wikipedia caption pick like for this
This is
entire revolt,
insanely evil.
and they don't
This
get
is
enough shit for it. I would say.
it's interesting because I mean obviously a lot of for instance in if you look at oh it's Hamas oh they're they're medieval or in the Syrian civil war oh these groups are medieval or whatever. I've never seen anybody do this. I've never seen anybody do anything like this.
Yeah, no, they were quite brutal in suppressing the revolt and killed a lot of people. And I feel like you more often hear about the things that the Zionists didn't like about the Arab Revolt period, which is them kind of cutting off the emigration quotas to Palestine at the end of the 1930s, right? Which,
Yeah.
in the view of some, turbo Zionists, proved that the British were against them and blah blah blah. But like in the overall battle, you can see Britain absolutely protecting their own interests by doing that, but at the same time are still fundamentally they lend their kind of armed forces completely to the Zionist side and also like arm and train a lot of the militias, correct? That
Mhm.
would go on all the way up to the Nakba and beyond, and become like the sort of the core of like the IDF. So yeah, the
Yeah.
British. I'm looking at this article right now. I don't know if you want to talk. We're a little short on time today to talk about like the popping off of the revolt itself. Yeah, wow. Sir Robert Thompson's influential defeating communist insurgency. Yeah, they
Yeah,
talk about
there's
the
a lot to
British
get into
way of
here.
counterinsurgency.
Yeah, maybe
Um,
there's something that's shorter that we can talk about with relation to 1929 and we can save
yeah,
the revolt
because
and
the
the
revolt
Jewish agency and
itself.
stuff for next time.
Right. The revolt
Yeah.
itself also intertwines with all of these international pre-World War II intrigues. And I definitely, maybe next time, hopefully. I read that whole book, Zionism, The Age of Dictators, which is very interesting in terms of, especially to kind of like compare up against the Mufti and sort of his interactions with Nazi Germany. And I've referenced it a lot.
Hmm.
We will get to it one day. But at the same time, a lot of that activity is obviously going on. The Arab Revolt pops off, and like the Zionist reaction to the Nazis and fascism in
Hmm.
general in like the 1930s is like very interesting. Of course, there's like a few different factions.
Yeah.
Jabotinsky kind of pops up as a major figure. I think he dies in up in the Catskills in 1940, but he was pretty active up into the end of his life. There's a lot of controversy around like an international boycott of German products that surprisingly, I mean, maybe not so surprisingly, but like you would think like that would be kind of a no-brainer for like a Jewish organization in the 1930s to
Hmm.
boycott German goods. But I think Jabotinsky's group, and you know, there were some Jewish like Trotskyists, but among Zionists, like I think Jabotinsky's group was the only one that actually supported a kind of boycott, but at the same time, like loved like Mussolini and much like the Mufti, actually, ironically, ended up on Mussolini's payroll for a little while, just like
Hmm.
the Mufti did in the late
Wow.
30s. Everybody was getting little something from Mussolini in the 30s. Yeah, but then the mainstream Zionists did not exactly acquit themselves because, well, you know, that's a whole thing to talk about. The Havara Agreement, right?
Hmm.
And also like the incredible economic stimulus that some of these money flows in the 30s produced in Palestine. Even before that, like one of the precipitating factors of the Arab Revolt is like the sharp. I think between 1933 and 36, there's like a sharp increase in immigration, right? Yeah, because of course the Nazis do take power. It's also the Great Depression, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything you want to read about 1929 in the time we
Yeah,
have
I'm trying
left.
to find. I think I did
I mean,
flag a good.
it kind of is like a big moment for the Mufti, you know, love him or
Yeah.
hate him, and that because this conflict adopts this like religious kind of dimension, I think that article kind of cited that like it was sort of put in his jurisdiction because it was like specifically a religious Muslim issue rather than a directly like political Arab issue or something like that. Not that there was a super powerful figure that could have really like stepped up if it were framed that way, but
Mhm.
he ends up being like the figurehead guy, like going into the 1930s, partially because even though he was not like an original instigator of it, but was kind of trying to do this moderate thing, it spiraled out of control, which, you know, redounded to the benefit of the Zionists. Worth mentioning next time is Jabotinsky's allegedly like insane 1926 like futuristic novel Samson.
Oh, I
That
don't.
I stumbled across that in the book yesterday, and I actually downloaded a copy of it. You can get a copy, but it's kind of like, you know, the sequel to Alt Neuland a little bit, but it has
Huh.
some. Yeah, he has kind of like a weird ecstatic vision of almost being at like a Goa Psytrance rave in the future, and like the rabbi kind of like getting everybody into like a collective hypnosis sort of thing, and it's like incredibly sounds incredibly fascist, and he's just like, oh my god, like the main character watches it and like a tear streaks down his face or something because like he lived so like Bronze Age or whatever. He was a wild motherfucker.
This is yeah, this is what I had. This kind of does get into the 30s a little bit, I think, but it's kind of an interesting prelude. I mean, maybe this is something to like do mostly next time. So through the 1920s, most Palestinian village lands were distributed in a form of joint tenure called mashah, which
Hmm.
you know we talked about this sort of land law issue here. From the outset, authorities sought to abolish mashah as a precondition of land registration and settlement. Biennial redistribution hinders progress by discouraging personal initiative and preventing the expenditure of capital by stereotyping the methods of cultivation. Ownership of detached lots separated from one another by the land of other proprietors is very general and places a serious obstacle in the way of an exact determination of the boundaries and the acquirement of a clear and valid title. The consolidation of such lots into continuous properties is a condition of the satisfactory economic development of the country, right? So they kind of had like communal land tenure in a way where they would kind of cycle, you know, the ownership of the lands. This became like
Mm.
an issue, right? Like in 1923, the Meshah Land Committee drafted plans to enforce the partition ifraz of divided lands into permanently fixed parcels, or mafruz. For the administration, the fiscal benefits to be derived from divided private proprietorship were paramount. The main objects of land settlement are to determine and register existing rights in land, to facilitate dealings and reduce litigation, and to provide an accurate record of landholding for the purpose of a fair and efficient distribution of land taxes. For Zionists, legislation designed to convert Masha'ah into mafruz would allow them to buy into the village patrimony and eventually alienate it from the peasants. But British and Zionist interests coincided on policy. As the director of lands informed the Federation of Jewish Farmers, once Jews had acquired a share of Mesha'eh land, they could force partition through the courts. If the co-owners do not agree between them as to partition, the application for partition from one of the co-owners is sufficient for the court to give a decision on the partition. Furthermore, a proper land settlement was also the only way to make lands available for the Jews without political complications. That's from a note on an interview with Mr. Stubbs, Director of Lands from 1879. Interesting. Oh, wait. Yeah, that's from March 1924, but I guess maybe this is a call number. With the land so divided, the corporate structure of the village economy was considerably more prone to disintegrate. The various co-cultivation partnerships, sharaka, would dissolve, and individual cultivators would depart from the overall agriculture regime previously scheduled by the community's elders. With the unraveling of economic coordination often came the fragmentation of those diverse forms of social organization linked to Mesha'eh. Villagers could expect to witness conflicts between family members over an increasingly smaller, scattered, and agriculturally worthless land inheritance. Disputes between adjacent plot holders from different kin groups over the boundaries of ever more numerous and irregular parcels. And village factionalism less and less constrained by the necessity of agricultural cooperation. Under such conditions, the remaining village lands might be purchased in short order. Frequently, however, Zionist purchasing agents would buy Mesha'eh shares from absentee owners or independent peasant proprietors, while granting villagers a temporary lease on the land. Because the price of Mafro's lands was generally 4 or 5 times that of Mesha'eh lands, this practice allowed the purchase of additional shares at a relatively modest cost. It also avoided lengthy litigation against the various boundary claims of many individuals when land settlement came to the village. If the lands were purchased in this way from absentee owners, then the political consequences of dispossession of the peasantry could also be mitigated. Arab owners, rather than the Jews, would be required to rid the land of tenants before final payment, and it would be up to these landowners to initiate partition proceedings against the remaining independent peasant holders. The Arab owners could themselves avoid the political onus of a sellout to the Jews by taking out fictitious mortgages and defaulting on them. The administration would then foreclose and offer the land at public auction to the highest bidder. Such, for example, were the tactics used by the Jewish National Fund for the acquisition of land owned by some members of the Abdul Hadi family in the village of Zabrin. Still, the peasants often attempted to maintain the land of Mesha'eh and generally avoided registration as long as possible. We talked a little bit about this. Despite strenuous efforts by the Department of Land Registry, in 1925, apparently 3/4 of the land of Palestine was still not registered. The Land Settlement Ordinance of 1928 thus pointedly aimed at abolishing Mesha'eh through forced division and registration. However, because of the difficulty in getting villagers to accede to a compulsory agreement over a permanent division of shares and fixing of parcels, it also had little initial success. Nevertheless, by 1930, only about half of the land of Palestine was still held in Mesha'eh, and barely 1/4 of it a decade later. Sometimes the peasants hoped to stave off the passing en masse of their threatened patrimony into the hands of others by first freezing the Mesha'eh themselves, Ifraz Barani. In the village of Isfia, for instance, when Mesha'eh shares were sold, the name of the previous shareholder and the location of the parcels he cultivated at the time were marked by the new owner in the official transfer deed. Subsequent redistribution of Mesha'eh parcels by lottery, however, meant that any given parcel will be assigned to different cultivators over time. Later, by suspending the system of periodic distribution, villagers could block outside shareholders from claiming any given parcel, for a cultivator whose name was not marked in the original transfer deed had a preemptory right to that parcel if he had continuously cultivated it over 10 years. Yet, as long as the village corporation remained intact, Mesha'eh constituted not only the preferred agrarian regime for extensive cereal cultivation, but the collectivity's principal means of blocking a sell-off by individual shareholders. Abdullah Samara to Arab executive on policy. Yeah, this is just a note. Parentheses are very weird in this article. Accordingly, the stronger the corporate integrity of the peasant community, the more likely is resistance to land settlement. Then he kind of just gives an example. Prevented economically weak members from selling out to Jews or absentee landholders. It also blocked economically strong members who would force partition to allow individual landholders the option to change the agrarian regime and raise land values. And this is a good part. For the authorities, however, Mesha'eh was an unmitigated evil. They, quote, unmitigated evil. There could be no rational colonial policy without land settlement, and no settlement with Mesha'eh. The introduction of the idea of cultivated communal land, this is a quote, is contrary to the land code and subversive, indeed, of the principles upon which it is based. Thus, it was an unquestioned axiom of all official reports on the agricultural condition of Palestine that, quote, one of the essential preconditions of the development is that the land shall be partitioned. A corollary to this axiom was that almost any partition, however officially bad, is better than no partition at all. Besides, the partition and settlement had reportedly worked in Egypt and the Punjab, and reports showed it could also work in Palestine. Still, the peasants stubbornly persisted in their economically pernicious and outworn ways. Quote, it appears evident that in certain areas the Arabs regard this system of tenancy, destructive as it is of all development, as a safeguard against alienation. Imagine an English village where every farmer each year is compelled to pass on his lands and buildings to a neighbor and receive some other neighbor's farm in exchange. He will get some inkling of what obstacles to progress can exist to agricultural development in Palestine. It never seemed to occur to the quote-unquote experts that such a scenario was as bizarre as the forced attempt to convert Palestinian fellaheen into yeomen. Yet that is precisely what the British policy aimed to do at every turn, it being, quote, considered that the principles of the English law, with some simplification, are applicable to Palestine. So, yeah, I will.
Yeah.
But this is a big part of the context for, what was to
Yeah.
come.
And going hand in hand with this, I read in other sources, was pretty much like the massive proletarianization, which occurred, I guess, as it did in many other countries, of basically driving the peasant farmers off of their land and forcing them to go work for like big Jewish operations, basically.
Yeah.
Though there's like another current of that where, because of the emerging kind of like racial contours of Mandate Palestine, that I think by the mid 1930s, they were not hiring actually even like huge numbers of Arab workers like in their enterprise. Like they were discriminating in their hiring against Arab workers like in certain sectors, which is leaving them jobless, but then all their farms are kind of being bought out. And you could see how the British would see this as a grave threat. It doesn't fit their logical system of legal ownership and everything. It's
Yeah.
obviously it's just like it's a an obstacle to them buying out or having Zionists buy out the entire region, so it has to go. It's an evil doctrine,
Yes.
But they do kind of manage to like progressively chip away at it, right, throughout the 30s. And then people are like economically kind of devastated, and I think the Jewish, because they were getting huge outflows, like particularly from Germany, the capital they were getting from Germany through a special agreement that was set up, actually like created kind of an artificial boom in the sort of Palestinian economy in the 30s when the whole world was mired in the Great Depression. But I think it's fair to say that probably those gains were not equally distributed with the Arab Palestinian population. And so, combination of land dispossession, proletarianization, job discrimination, so you can't even get good lower wage jobs, in these Israeli companies that are being built up, and this creeping sense, like taking over the Wailing Wall, that what bit by bit they're nibbling away at it. That's the maelstrom out of which the Great Arab Revolt of '36 erupts, right?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely like a big factor. And like you mentioned like the proletarianization, it is interesting like how, there was like, this sort of communism and socialism or the discourse around it or concerns about it did like kind of play a role in a lot of this. Like
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. Like there was, I'm reading this quote here, like because this article, this by the way, this is by a scholar at the Hebrew University. This article is from 1989. It's the surrogate colonization of Palestine, by Scott Atran, and yeah, he has this interesting quote here. In August 1929, Arab rioting spread over the country sparked by a demonstration on Jerusalem's Temple Mount in the name of Batar, the militant Jewish nationalist and anti-communist revisionist youth movement. Batar was protesting Arab provocation and harassment of Jewish worshippers at the Wailing Wall. Ironically, the harassment, which included the installation of Muslim prayer callers and musical ceremonies, or dhikr, near the wall, was itself in protest against the arrogance of Jewish Bolshevists who sought to gradually take possession of Al-Aqsa on the pretense that it is the temple, by starting with the Western Wall. That's from Al-Amin al-Husseini's statement, or Haj Amin al-Husseini.
Wait, he called them Jewish Bolshevists that want to take over?
Apparently in 1928,
Huh.
in
Well,
Jamia Al
yeah.
Arabiya.
He would be known for his anti-communism later. As with
Yeah.
the Zionists, they
I
really
mean, it's
they
also possible that he was. I mean, certainly he did later become known by his anti-Zionism, but it almost would make sense that he would want to play to the
the
sort of
British.
sympathies of the British, who definitely
Exactly,
would be.
exactly.
We remember Churchill's whole letter and everything about the
Right,
battle for the soul of the
right.
Jewish people between the two Jewish movements of Zionism and communism.
Right. And
Right?
that would
Yeah.
pop up in the 30s as well, where the Zionist leaders would often kind of point to communist sympathy for the Arabs, the Arab position and Arab independence and things like that as, you got to watch out because, like, all the more reason to give Palestine to us because these Arabs are going to become communist. Like, you can see it. So you need us as a bulwark against communism. And actually, it's actually shocking how much in the kind of the early days of like when the Nazis took power, like in the diaspora, how pretty much every Zionist group would absolutely not like march alongside or join anything with like CPUSA or even the Trotskyist Socialist Workers Party or like anybody that was like any kind of socialist or Marxist or communist, like even when not to say that would have really like changed, the course of history or something, but like that probably would have helped rather than what they did, which was still prioritize kind of anti-communism as something that was like a deal breaker for them. Like even the labor Zionists in pretty much most cases, who kind of preached a certain kind of socialism, they were aligning themselves with Western capitalist powers, very consciously.
Yeah.
Um,
Definitely true. Yeah. So we'll continue to talk about that.
for
I
sure.
suppose next time. Yeah. Um, as we continue
Yeah,
to
we'll
make
get
our
into some
way.
dirty 30s intrigues. And I
Yeah,
mean, I
there's a
think
lot of good
that this
stuff there.
Jewish agency in Syria book
Yeah, it's
is
pretty
very
interesting.
interesting
Yeah, it
about
resonates a lot. Yeah.
the foundation of like kind of Israeli espionage. Really,
Yes.
it gets into a lot of their intrigues and it's like when we're talking about, yeah, they're kind of doing psyops on their own people and kind of doing disinfo to make it sound like the Arabs are doing something they actually weren't planning. I mean, it says right here, like I don't know, I forget if you read this before, where Weizmann, they set up this information bureau when the
Hmm.
mandate gets established, and he ordered them to pursue six objectives. One, stirring up strife between Arab Christians and Muslims. Two,
Yeah.
buying anti Zionist Arab newspapers and persuading them to support Zionism. Three, buy off notables in the Nablus area to work against the Palestinian national movement active in the city of Nablus and co opting them by bribes, forgery, or both to collect, quote, petitions calling for a British mandate on Palestine
Yeah.
and also demanding Jewish immigration to Palestine and the establishment of a club as a base for those who supported collaboration with Zionism. Four, working to form an alliance with tribal sheikhs in Transjordan so as to undermine their relationship with Syria, counteract their support for the Palestinian national movement, and get them to produce, again, quote, petitions in support of Zion. I like that they have to quote that, like fake petitions in support of Zionism, Jewish immigration, and a British mandate. And finally, seeking to establish relations with Bedouin sheikhs in the Negev in an attempt to
Hmm.
disrupt the relationships developing between them and the leaders of the Palestinian national movement. And, oh, sorry, last one, establishing joint clubs for Jews and Arabs to spread Zionist ideas and propaganda and to incite against the Palestinian national movement and its leadership. This is in like 1919, I think, when
Yeah,
he's
we
saying
read
this.
like the first couple of pages of this like earlier
1920.
on, but
Yeah, you
yeah,
did. You
like
read like
we
immediately he started spying on them. Like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
that was that
exactly.
book. Yeah,
Yeah,
but I like a lot of the stuff. Yeah.
yeah. And then like it gets pretty interesting and definitely resonant with what like we're seeing now, especially like, the Syria elements.
Right. In terms
Um,
of their intelligence apparatus, it always was like this whole region. It wasn't just
yeah.
in Palestine, and Syria was an important part of it. And like getting everybody to fight with each other and kind of like manipulate people, is that's been the game since even before the mandate was established, with the main Zionists. And then, you know, these are the soft Zionists. Then Jabotinsky throws kind of like terrorism and agent provocateur kind of actions kind of into the mix. And I'd love to talk about like his love, like how a lot of these guys were like literally fascists. Obviously,
Yeah.
some of them really did become like Nazi puppet quislings that like shamefully were kind of saying that like, oh, Hitler's actually like not that bad. But like most of them, they couldn't say Hitler is like chill actually. But there's an interesting things going back to the beginning of Zionism with this kind of feeling that like anti-Semitism is so permanent and baked in, and it almost gets to a weird point of like being anti-Semitic, of almost like, well,
Oh yeah,
everywhere we go,
we've
like they're
touched on
gonna,
that a bit before.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so in a way, like there's a lot of like quotes that did not age well of various Zionist leaders being like, I think the one brutal one was like, Hitler will pass from history in a few years, but there shall be a monument to him in Palestine or something like that, because like he's like an instrument of history to get people to wake up and realize that like they have no future in Europe, they have to go to Palestine. Like there's we've mentioned it before, the convergence of interests of the Nazis wanting to get rid of Jews and then the Zionists wanting to get the Jews out of Europe to go to Palestine. They definitely recognize that convergence of interests, and it leads to some very strange bedfellow situations. But we can talk about that and other things next time.
All right.
So yeah, we'll leave it there for now. But until then, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.